Hey guys, tonight we're digging our hands into something earthy, ancient and oddly controversial. This is the story of vegetables. Yes, vegetables, that once ruled the medieval dinner plate, but have since been wiped off the map, quietly erased by industrial farming, changing tastes, and some truly strange historical twists. You're about to wander into a garden that's not just forgotten, it was forcibly buried. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there? I'm always curious who's up late with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with dirt. Dark, loamy medieval soil under your fingernails. You're crouched in the garden of a stone-walled manor house in England, maybe France, sometime in the early 1300s. The sun is just brushing the trees with golden mist, and around you grows a veritable jungle of green things. Some spiky, some curling, others shooting straight up like they're in a competition, but you don't recognise most of it. In fact, if this was a modern grocery store, you'd think the produce aisle had just sprouted tentacles. There are roots that look like twisted bones, leaves the size of soup plates, and edible stalks that smell oddly like licorice. You're surrounded by what we might now call lost vegetables. You pick up a skirret root, white, thin, a bit knobbly, like a smaller, sweeter parsnip. It was once so prized for its delicate sugariness that it featured in royal feasts. Now, almost no one grows it, and most seed catalogues don't even bother listing it. In medieval times, skirret was as common as carrots, and for some, even better tasting. It thrived in cooler climates, loved wet feet, and didn't mind being crowded. Its roots grew in bunches like fingers, ready to be boiled, stewed, or, if you were lucky, fried in butter. That's your first clue that something weird happened between then and now, because here's the thing, skirret didn't disappear because it was poisonous, or because it didn't grow well. It disappeared because it didn't fit the industrial mould. It was hard to harvest mechanically. Its roots weren't uniform, and in a world obsessed with predictability, same size, same shape, same shelf life, that was a death sentence, and that's just one vegetable. You glance over and see another plant, tall, glossy leaves, a stalk that smells faintly of pepper. That's Alexanders. It was the green vegetable before celery took over. Romans brought it to Britain, and for over 1,000 years it grew in kitchen gardens, cloisters, and even along castle walls. Spicy, hardy, and versatile, it was added to soups, stews, and meat dishes for a bold, slightly bitter edge. But like skirret, it didn't make the cut. Once industrial agriculture standardised what good vegetables looked and tasted like. You walk a little farther, brushing past a herbaceous plant with jagged-edged leaves. It's called Good King Henry. Yes, it sounds like a fairy tale, but it was very real and very edible. A poor man's spinach, they called it. Rich in iron, calcium, and historical irony. It was free, it grew like a weed, and it helped feed peasants and monks for centuries. But in the age of big ag, that kind of independence became inconvenient. No one's making a profit if you can harvest your dinner from the side of the road. In this garden, you begin to feel something unsettling. A sense that these vegetables weren't just forgotten, they were eliminated, slowly, systematically, as agriculture became commerce, and commerce became control. What's left in our supermarkets today? Cucumbers, tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, all neat, all efficient, all bred for transport, not taste. All able to fit into machines, boxes, barcodes. There's a word for this, and it's not just progress, it's erasure. Edible erasia, and you're standing in the ghost of what we used to eat. But here's a quirkier twist. Some of these vegetables didn't vanish purely because of farming logic. Some vanished because of magic, or at least the suspicion of it. Women, especially older women, who grew obscure herbs and strange-looking roots were often seen as suspicious. If you knew how to treat illness with a bitter green, you were unnatural. Some of these forgotten veggies got tangled in the mass paranoia of witch trials. A strange-smelling plant with healing properties, that was enough to get you questioned. Or worse. Back in the garden, you hear a soft rustle. A monk in a brown robe walks by, basket in hand. He's humming something Gregorian and plucking leaves like he knows exactly what each plant can do, and he does. Monasteries were the medieval equivalent of seed vaults. They guarded plant knowledge, cultivated biodiversity, and kept obscure vegetables alive through invasions, plagues, and famines. But when monasteries were dissolved, especially during Henry VIII's reign, a lot of that knowledge died with them. Some plants faded quietly, others were actively purged, and the scholarly debate, it's still going. Some food historians argue we ditched these plants because they genuinely didn't taste great by today's standards. Others say that's a product of palate training. We've been conditioned to like sweet, mild, and bland over bitter, fibrous, and funky. Maybe Alexander's isn't bad. Maybe we just forgot how to appreciate it. You squat beside the skirret patch again, watching a bee dance lazily over the flowers. There's something sacred about this garden. Not because it's holy, but because it's whole, untamed, flavourful, bizarre. It reminds you that history doesn't just live in books. Sometimes it roots itself in the soil, gets composted by centuries, and waits for someone like you to start digging, and that's exactly what you're going to do. You turn back to that patch of strange roots and settle your eyes on something almost spidery. Thin white tendrils twist from a stubby crown, curling into the dirt like pale fingers. This, right here, is skirret, your first forgotten vegetable. You run your hand across its feathery green top, and it smells faintly of celery and sugar. Odd combo, sure, but skirret didn't need to impress with flair. Its charm was subtle. In the Middle Ages, skirret was the unsung hero of feasts, often served boiled, buttered, or made into fritters so sweet and tender they barely held together on the fork. You can picture it now, a long wooden table groaning with dishes, a roasted boar's head at the centre, and beside it, humble bowls of mashed skirret with herbs. You'd think it was just a side dish, but for many families, especially in the colder parts of Europe, it was a lifeline. Potatoes didn't show up until centuries later, so this was the comfort food that warmed winter nights. Skirret thrives where modern crops would whine. Heavy clay, poor drainage, short summers. The more miserable the weather, the sweeter the roots. That's because cold encourages sugar accumulation, and unlike modern monocrops that need perfect conditions and coddling, skirret just dealt with it. No fertiliser tantrums, no pest drama. You plant it, water it, wait, and then you eat. It's the kind of resilience today's agriculture used to value, before it got addicted to control. But skirret had a fatal flaw: chaos. Its roots don't grow in uniform, store-friendly shapes. Each one is a little different, some fat and short, others long and knotted. For hand harvesting, that's fine. For machines, not so much. And once industrial agriculture demanded that every vegetable be ready for conveyor belts and plastic trays, skirret's time was up. It couldn't be tamed, it couldn't be shaped into the dull perfection of a baby carrot, so it was labelled inefficient, and like that, it was gone. There's another quirky reason skirret never caught its second wind. It's almost too sweet. When sugar became cheap and everywhere, people started craving contrast. They wanted bitter greens with their meat. They wanted acid with their fat. Skirret suddenly felt old-fashioned, even childish. It had the misfortune of tasting like dessert at the exact moment everyone was craving bitterness, an irony only culinary history could pull off. Now, not everyone agrees on why skirret disappeared. There's a debate bubbling in the seed-saving world. Some argue that its decline had less to do with taste or shape and more with seed control. See, skirret doesn't breed true from seed. You have to propagate it clonally, from root divisions. That makes it harder to package and sell in mass quantities. And what do you know? Crops that reproduce easily by seed are very attractive to seed companies. With skirret, there's no annual seed sale, no dependable licensing, no repeat customers. It's self-sufficient. And that, in the modern food economy, makes it a liability. You pick one of the roots and snap it open. The inside is creamy white, almost glowing in the dappled light. The smell is sweet, like parsnip but with a milder candy-like edge. You bite into it raw, because why not? And it's surprisingly juicy. Not crunchy like a carrot, but fibrous in a soft way. Almost like chewing through a stalk of cooked asparagus, but colder and slightly gritty. Nearby, a battered recipe book lies open on a stone ledge, its pages stained with old butter and what you hope is beet juice. In faded ink, someone has written, "Skirret fried in butter with peason and mustard." Translation: skirret, fried with peas and mustard. Sounds weird, probably delicious. There's a romantic notion among garden historians that if we just started planting skirret again, it would flourish. But it's not that simple. Modern agriculture isn't just about what grows, it's about what sells, stores, ships, and scales. Skirret fails nearly every one of those tests. It bruises easily, it rots fast, it looks ugly by supermarket standards. It's a reminder that food systems aren't meritocracies, they're supply chains, and skirret is the vegetable equivalent of an indie film with terrible distribution. Still, it's not entirely extinct. A few eccentric growers in the UK and parts of Scandinavia keep it alive, mostly out of curiosity and stubborn love. They swap root cuttings in online forums, whisper cooking tips in seed-saving meetups, and dream of the day skirret makes its comeback. Maybe on the menu of a fancy restaurant that's finally run out of ways to plate carrots. Maybe in your own backyard. The bee returns, hovering near the skirret flowers. You follow it with your eyes, half lulled by the buzz. It flits over to another plant that looks like celery but isn't. That, you'll find out next, is Alexander's, and it's got its own weird story. But for now, let skirret root itself in your imagination. Picture a world where vegetables weren't plastic-wrapped or shrink-fitted into expectation. Where sweetness came from the soil, not a lab. Where a humble, odd-shaped root could be the star of dinner, not a footnote in a forgotten garden journal. You glance once more at the patch and feel a pang, nostalgia for something you've never tasted. That's the power of a vanished vegetable. It leaves a hole not just in your plate, but in your memory. Skirret was never meant to be perfect, just satisfying, seasonal, and real. And that's exactly why it got banned. You follow that bee lazily drifting through the warm medieval air, buzzing its way over to another plant that, at first glance, looks like celery's stockier cousin. Tall, with glossy green stems and broad leaves that almost shimmer in the light, it stands proudly like it knows it used to be somebody, and once upon a time it absolutely was. You reach down and snap off a stalk. It smells peppery, strong, almost medicinal. This is Alexander's. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Few people have. It's one of those plants that got shuffled into the dusty filing cabinet labelled pre-modern vegetables somewhere between probably edible and what even is that? But back in the day, Alexander's was everywhere. It was so popular that it basically carpeted monastery gardens, castle plots, and even city herb beds. The Romans introduced it across Europe, and they didn't do that for fun. This wasn't some exotic garnish. Alexander's was a culinary workhorse. Its flavour, somewhere between celery, parsley, and a faint tickle of black pepper. But don't expect the crispy snap of supermarket celery. Alexander's has bite, not just in taste, but in texture. The stems can be a little stringy, the leaves a little tough, and that's exactly why it fell out of favour. You imagine standing in a medieval kitchen, someone stirring a thick pot of stew over an open flame. A bunch of Alexanders sits on the chopping block, waiting to be tossed in with barley, onions, and whatever meat was available. Boar if you're lucky, pigeon if not. The plant wasn't just a garnish. It was flavour, bulk, and medicine all rolled into one. The roots were edible. The seeds, used as a pepper substitute. The whole plant screamed utility. It could even treat digestive issues and act as a diuretic. Your medieval stomach. It probably knew Alexander's better than you know kale. But come the 18th century, Alexander's started its slow fade into obscurity. One reason? Celery. That neat, blanched, easy-to-chew vegetable we know today is the result of centuries of careful breeding. Celery was refined to be sweeter, crisper, and, crucially, more photogenic. It played nicer with knives and dentures, it looked better in cookbooks, and unlike Alexander's, it didn't bolt at the first hint of heat, or need foraging from cliffs and seawalls. You might think, why not grow both? And for a while, people did. But the rise of standardised agriculture meant fewer options, not more. Farmers were under pressure to grow what sold fast and stored well. And Alexander's, it didn't store well at all. It wilted quickly, grew unevenly, and had a short harvest window. Supermarkets don't like that kind of drama. And then there's the wild factor. Alexanders is what they call a naturalised plant. It escaped cultivation and now grows feral along coasts and riverbanks in parts of the UK. In fact, if you go walking in springtime near the English seaside, there's a decent chance you've passed it. Tall, green, almost regal, often mistaken for overgrown parsley. But despite its easy access, hardly anyone picks it. Fewer cook with it, and no one sells it. Why? There's a cultural gap here, a weird kind of amnesia. Somewhere along the way we decided that wild plants were untrustworthy, that unless something came shrink-wrapped with a barcode, it couldn't be safe. This mentality helped finish off Alexanders. Too wild, too weird, too bitter. That last one especially. Bitterness became a villain sometime in the 20th century, kicked out of the kitchen by generations raised on sugar and starch. But here's a fringe fact you'll love. Alexanders was once considered an aphrodisiac. Yep. In medieval medical texts, it was described as warming, stimulating, and, useful for those looking to spice up their love life. So in addition to curing your digestive woes and seasoning your stew, it may have gotten you lucky. Not bad for a vegetable now deemed ornamental. Of course, not everyone's on board with bringing Alexanders back. Some botanists warn that it's invasive, outcompeting native flora when left unchecked. Others say it's an ecological placeholder, filling the void left by other truly extinct plants. The scholarly debate is far from settled. Was Alexanders an agricultural casualty, or a botanical bully in disguise? As you chew a tiny leaf just to see what the fuss is about, your mouth flinches. Whoa, there it is. That punch of flavour. It's bold. Not in a taste-like-burning way, but definitely not subtle. It makes celery taste like water, and you get it now. This plant wasn't meant to be background noise. It was the bass note in the stew, the shout beneath the sizzle. You imagine how different our meals might be if we'd kept it around. Maybe we wouldn't need bouillon cubes or powdered stocks. Maybe we'd have a higher tolerance for strong herbal flavours. Maybe bitter wouldn't scare us. But instead, Alexanders got filed under archaic and slowly edited out of our edible vocabulary. And here's the weirdest part. Alexanders never really went away. It's still growing, blooming every spring, seeding itself without permission. It's not extinct, it's just ignored. It thrives in cracks, coastal edges, and forgotten gardens. It doesn't care if we like it or not, and there's something deeply poetic about that. A vegetable ghosting us before we could ghost it. You run your fingers over the dark seeds forming on the flower heads. They smell vaguely spicy. They once filled medieval spice jars when black pepper was too expensive to import. You think about how many flavours have vanished not because they were bad, but because they weren't marketable. You start to see a pattern. Every plant you pass has a story not just of extinction, but of erasia. Alexanders bows slightly in the wind, as if acknowledging your curiosity. It doesn't mind being remembered, but it doesn't need you either, and that's maybe the coolest thing about it. It's still here, just waiting. You look up. A cluster of soft, leafy plants grows nearby, short and a little messy. They look like weeds, but you're starting to learn better. This next one is called Good King Henry, and its tale is as humble as its name is ridiculous. You shuffle through the patch of tall Alexanders, and your eyes land on a scraggly little cluster of green pushing up near a mossy stone wall. Low-growing, with arrow-shaped leaves and soft little flower stalks, it looks like the kind of thing most people would yank out of their gardens without a second thought. But here, among the carefully tended chaos of this medieval plot, it holds a place of honour. This is Good King Henry. Yes, that's really its name. And no, it was not named after a monarch who had anything to do with vegetables. Probably. Its nickname, you learn, comes from a German phrase, Guter Heinrich, which loosely translates to good old Henry, like a friendly uncle who always shows up with a loaf of bread and mildly unsolicited advice. And this plant, much like that uncle, was dependable. For centuries, it fed the rural poor across Europe. You reach down, pluck a leaf, and roll it between your fingers. It feels soft, a little waxy, and smells faintly like spinach with a grassy edge. That makes sense. This plant was known as poor man's spinach, and it was a staple long before the baby spinach boom made greens trendy. Back then, vegetables didn't arrive in plastic tubs labelled power greens. You had what you could grow or gather, and if it grew on its own with little encouragement, even better. Good King Henry was exactly that. Perennial, rugged, and oddly nutritious. The leaves were cooked like spinach, the young shoots eaten like asparagus, and even the seeds could be ground into flour if you were feeling ambitious or more likely starving. In fact, this plant wasn't just food, it was survival. When your barley ran low and your turnips were gone, Good King Henry was still there. It didn't mind being neglected. In fact, it kind of preferred it. You didn't have to till the earth or coddle it with compost. Just let it grow, cut what you needed, and trust that it would be back next year. But of course, as you already suspect, that kind of low-maintenance reliability spelled doom in the modern age. By the time agriculture became industrialised, Good King Henry's independence was a problem. You couldn't easily grow it in rows, you couldn't get identical leaves or predictable yields, and it didn't look nice on a shelf. The leaves wilt fast after picking, and there's a brief window before they turn tough and fibrous. Not great for shipping, not ideal for supermarkets, and definitely not something you could trademark. You lean in closer. The plant has tiny, unassuming flowers that barely register at a glance. No drama, no splashy colours. It's the opposite of everything Big Ag has tried to make vegetables into. Silent, homely, useful, and, ironically, more nutritious than half the greens lining store shelves today. But here's a quirky little footnote. During the Victorian era, Good King Henry almost had a comeback. Some well-meaning botanists tried to rebrand it as Lincolnshire spinach, hoping to turn it into a fashionable garden green. It kind of worked, for about 5 minutes, but like many trends driven more by novelty than nostalgia, it fizzled fast. No royal endorsement, no marketing campaign, no seed company pushing it as the next big thing, so back into obscurity it went. The academic debate over Good King Henry is one of those niche, but surprisingly heated ones. Some agricultural historians argue that it wasn't pushed out. It just faded away because better options came along. After all, spinach did eventually become more palatable, and varieties were developed to be sweeter and less fibrous. Others argue that's missing the point entirely. The disappearance wasn't just about flavour, it was about control. Spinach could be grown in tight rows, packaged neatly, and harvested on a schedule. Good King Henry, it showed up when it felt like it. It was the punk rock of vegetables, wild, loyal, a little gritty, and impossible to brand. You imagine a medieval woman, apron dusted in flour, stepping outside her cottage in the cool morning mist to snap off a few shoots for soup. No weighing, no barcode, no pesticides, just habit and hunger. Maybe she knew its name, maybe she called it something else. What mattered was that it grew. It kept growing, and it kept her family alive through seasons when little else did. There's a faint irony in how this once ordinary vegetable is now considered rare, niche, even exotic in the foraging world. It's been pushed so far out of the mainstream that you'd have to hunt through obscure seed banks or shady corners of Reddit to find someone offering rootstock, and when you do, you'll probably get a warning. Don't expect it to germinate fast, it's stubborn. But that stubbornness is kind of the whole point, isn't it? Good King Henry was never flashy. It didn't need coddling, and it didn't beg for attention. It was there for the long haul, a vegetable that thrived under neglect and gave back more than it took. In today's world of food that demands packaging, spin, and a dedicated Instagram presence, it almost makes too much sense that something this humble got quietly written out of the story. And yet, here you are, surrounded by it. The soft hush of its leaves swaying in the breeze, the way it curls up protectively at night, and that quiet sturdiness in the way it holds space in the garden. You touch the soil around it, cool, slightly damp, full of life. It feels like a memory you never made, but somehow still remember. Something deep-rooted and generational. Something honest. You stand up and brush the dirt from your hands. Behind you, the patch of Alexanders whispers its peppery farewell. Good King Henry doesn't say much. It just stays rooted. And just ahead, there's a new patch of unfamiliar green, with leaves shaped like spoons and roots hiding beneath that once rivaled carrots in popularity. This, dear traveller, is Rampion and, It's got a fairy tale you weren't expecting. You step lightly across a narrow row of packed earth, eyes drawn to a plant with soft rounded leaves that sit low to the ground like a timid guest at a rowdy feast. The colour is a muted green, almost silvery in places, and the leaves form a little rosette, neat and tidy. Something about it feels delicate, refined even. But then you notice the roots peeking through the soil, thick, creamy white, with a shape that's somewhere between a parsnip and a turnip. This is Rampion. Or if you're feeling particularly literary, Rapunzel. Yep, that Rapunzel. The fairy tale, the tower, the long hair, that whole story. It began with a craving for this very plant. In the Brothers Grimm version, Rapunzel's mother spies a patch of Rampion growing in a forbidden garden and becomes so obsessed with it that her husband steals some for her, triggering the chain of events that ends with a baby in a tower and a witch problem, all over a salad green. Kind of poetic. Rampion isn't just folklore bait though. In the real Middle Ages, it was a legit 2-for-1 crop. The leaves were eaten fresh or cooked, tender and slightly nutty, kind of like a mild spinach. And the root? Sweet, earthy, a little like a cross between a radish and a turnip, but gentler on the palate. You could mash it, roast it, or even eat it raw if you were feeling brave, or hungry. It was the kind of vegetable that didn't need to scream for attention. It was simply useful. And that, as you've probably guessed by now, is the kind of trait that often gets vegetables erased. You kneel and gently brush some soil from the base of one plant. It's almost graceful in the way it's grown, like it knows it's from an era where food was more intimate. You had to touch the dirt, wait for the seasons, watch the leaves for signs of readiness. Rampion was woven into those rhythms. It didn't grow fast and it didn't store well. You had to harvest it fresh and use it quickly. Not exactly what modern supply chains dream of. By the 1600s, Rampion was already starting to lose ground to faster, flashier crops. Carrots were becoming sweeter and more consistent thanks to Dutch breeding. Lettuce was starting to appear in more varieties, and turnips were just easier. Rampion, with its slower germination, short shelf life and quirky taste, got pushed to the margins. By the 19th century it was mostly a curiosity, something a few old herbalists still grew, or that might pop up in a forgotten corner of a monastery garden. But the fairy tale didn't help. Ironically, the one thing keeping Rampion's name alive in pop culture also confused people about what it actually was. Many readers assumed Rapunzel referred to a made-up plant. Others mistook it for ramp, totally different species. Some even thought it was a kind of lettuce, so Rampion's identity began to blur. It became botanical folklore, symbolic, but not real, not food. There's something uniquely frustrating about that, isn't there? A plant so embedded in a famous story that it's forgotten as an actual edible, like if Cinderella's slipper were real, but no one remembered you could actually wear it. Today, Rampion is mostly known to heirloom gardeners, obscure chefs, and wild plant nerds. You can still find seeds if you dig deep into heritage catalogues or hang around the weirder corners of gardening forums. But even if you plant it, prepare to wait. Rampion takes time, weeks just to germinate and months before the roots are ready to dig. And it's picky, doesn't like being moved, doesn't appreciate shade. Basically, Rampion wants you to commit. Of course, there are fringe holdouts. In parts of Italy, especially in rural Tuscany, Rampion is still foraged and occasionally cultivated. There it's called raponzolo, and served in simple dishes that haven't changed much in centuries. Think warm root salads with olive oil and lemon, or the leaves sautéed with garlic. Not fancy, just honest. The scholarly debate surrounding Rampion is one of culinary nostalgia versus practicality. Some food historians argue that Rampion's fall from grace was inevitable. Compared to carrots or spinach, it simply offered less reward for more work. Others push back, hard. They say it's a prime example of how taste and tradition were sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. That Rampion wasn't less rewarding, just less convenient, and that's an important distinction. You run your fingers across the leaves. They're cool, slightly velvety, and surprisingly tender. You nibble one. The flavour is mild, with just a hint of bitterness on the back of your tongue. It tastes like something that would do well with a vinaigrette. You imagine it paired with shaved cheese, maybe walnuts. Okay, now you're hungry. The root, once pulled and cleaned, is a bit firmer than you expect. Slicing into it releases a sweet vegetal scent, almost floral. In a time before sugar was cheap, Rampion roots offered a subtle sweetness that could round out stews or soften the sharpness of other greens. Not a main event, maybe, but an essential supporting role. You stand up and look around at the garden, now filling with golden late afternoon light. Every step deeper into this patchwork of forgotten flavours feels like unearthing a secret menu, a culinary language we stopped speaking. And Rampion, that was the quiet poetry of the meal. Not flashy, not bold, but the kind of ingredient that told you someone had thought carefully about what they were feeding you. And maybe that's what we lost when Big Ag took over. Not just biodiversity, but intimacy. The time it took to coax flavour from the soil, the patience to wait for slow crops, the trust in plants that didn't come with QR codes and guaranteed yields. You take one last look at the Rampion patch, its spoon-shaped leaves rustling softly in the breeze, and smile. A fairy tale plant with both feet in the dirt. Forgotten, but not gone. Like most of these vegetables, it just needs someone to remember how to listen to it. And just a few feet away, another plant stretches out across the ground, broad leaves catching the salt-scented air. Sea kale. This one's from the coast, and it's got stories soaked in brine. You follow the scent before you even see the plant. It's sharp, clean, almost like a splash of sea spray mixed with cabbage. A strangely specific aroma, and yet exactly what you'd expect from a vegetable that used to thrive on wind-lashed shores and chalky cliffs. There, sprawling like a sleepy sea creature across the sandy earth, is a low, leafy tangle, sea kale. Thick, waxy leaves the colour of stormy water curl up from tough pale stems, and at the base, hidden under the grit, fat rhizomes sleep like buried treasure. Sea kale is a survivor, rugged, salty and unbothered by conditions that would send most crops into therapy. Native to the coasts of northern and western Europe, it's one of those rare plants that actually likes being neglected. You could plant it in the richest soil on earth, and it would sneer at you. But give it gravel, give it sand, hit it with cold wind and morning fog, and it'll thank you by coming back year after year with edible stems, tender leaves, and sweet, nutty roots. You reach down and tug gently at one of the stalks. The leaves are thick and blue-green. Their surface is a bit waxy, nature's version of a windbreaker. You snap off a young shoot and hold it up. It looks like asparagus if asparagus went through a tough breakup and spent 6 months lifting weights. When blanched and cooked, these shoots used to be a delicacy, and not just in peasant kitchens. Sea kale once had a moment in the sun at Victorian dinner tables, prized for its flavour and strange coastal origins. But, as always, its fall was as quiet as its rise. Sea kale didn't play well with industrialisation. It's a perennial, which means it grows back every year, but it also means it needs time to establish, and its yields can be unpredictable. Worse still, it's stubbornly regional. Try moving it far from the coast and it sulks. Sea kale wanted to stay near the sea, and as agriculture turned inland and mechanised, sea kale got left behind like some salty old fisherman who refused to wear a tie to the office. You imagine a family living near Dover in the 1500s, walking along the pebbled beach in spring, gathering sea kale shoots from the dunes. They would have known just when to pick them, before the stalks got too tough, before the leaves turned bitter. The roots, when roasted, gave off a smell like roasting chestnuts. The leaves, young and boiled, were said to be better than cabbage, and the flowering stems, sweet and succulent when picked at just the right moment. It wasn't one vegetable, it was 3. But here's where it gets weird. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sea kale had an unlikely glow-up. Gardeners in England started forcing it, just like they did with rhubarb. Forcing, in case you're not deep in vegetable slang, means covering the plant in darkness to encourage pale, tender shoots. They'd bury sea kale under clay pots or boxes, and the resulting blanched stems were considered a luxury, often served with butter and a bit of vinegar. Fancy, right? In fact, it was so popular among upper-class Victorians that it showed up in garden manuals, complete with illustrations and tips for proper forcing techniques. But then, as usual, convenience and control took over. The rise of global shipping meant you could get asparagus year-round. Broccoli became a go-to green, and sea kale, with its fussy coastal temperament and easily bruised shoots, quietly slinked back into obscurity. By the mid-20th century, hardly anyone grew it. It vanished from markets, restaurants, and most seed catalogues. Another quirky green lost to the march of homogeneity. Of course, not everyone forgot. There's a fringe group of horticulturists and foragers who keep sea kale alive, literally. A few brave souls in the UK and northern France still tend to their clumps, harvesting just enough to keep the plant going year to year. You'll even find it listed in obscure perennial gardening books under unusual edibles. But it's more a curiosity than a crop now, something you grow for conversation rather than calories. You take a bite of the blanched stalk you picked. Raw, it's intense. Like cabbage and mustard had a baby raised by the sea. Cooked though, it mellows out, develops a nutty, almost buttery flavour. Imagine asparagus with a hint of ocean breeze. It's the kind of taste that makes you sit up a little straighter. This isn't background vegetable. This is the main character, waiting to be rediscovered. There's some debate among food historians about why sea kale really vanished. Was it too regional? Too hard to scale? Or did it just fall victim to our shifting palates? Some scholars think we moved away from these bold, briny flavours as inland diets took over. Others argue it was simply a matter of economics. You can't put sea kale in a sealed bag and fly it across the world without losing something. It resists commodification, and that makes it a problem for big ag. Then there's the ecological piece. Sea kale used to help stabilise coastal dunes and prevent erosion. In some places it still does. Its roots dig deep, its leaves catch the wind, and its presence creates a kind of quiet resilience in fragile ecosystems. Losing sea kale isn't just about flavour. It's about forgetting that our food used to belong to places, to seasons, to soil types, to microclimates. Sea kale knew where it was from, and it refused to pretend otherwise. You look around the garden and notice how out of place it feels here. Landlocked, surrounded by forest plants and inland crops. And yet, here it grows, defiant. Maybe a little smaller than it would be on the coast, but still, alive, still salty, still itself. There's something kind of beautiful about that. Sea kale doesn't want to be mass-produced. It wants to be found, picked fresh, eaten close to the place it grew. It asks us to return to the shoreline, to the idea that food isn't just fuel, it's geography. You brush your fingers over the leathery leaves one last time. They rattle like paper in the breeze. Then, just a few steps away, another dark-skinned root pokes through the dirt. This one looks like a parsnip dressed for a funeral. It's called Scorzonera, and it's got secrets under the skin. It catches your eye like something lurking beneath the surface, half buried, long and dark, with a rough black skin that looks more like tree bark than something you'd willingly eat. But make no mistake, this unassuming root has history, mystery, and just a little swagger hidden beneath its rugged exterior. You kneel beside it, brushing away the dirt to reveal a slender tapering root. This is Scorzonera, sometimes called black Salsify, sometimes simply the root you've never heard of. If you're judging by appearances, it's not winning any beauty contests. In fact, Scorzonera looks like something you might trip over in the woods, not served with roasted duck and wine. But crack it open and peel back that sooty skin, and inside is a creamy ivory flesh that smells faintly of artichokes and almonds. Earthy, nutty, slightly sweet. It's like the shy cousin of the parsnip standing off to the side at the dinner party waiting to be noticed. And in medieval and early modern Europe, it was noticed. Scorzonera was grown widely in gardens and prized for its flavour, versatility, and, get this, its supposed power to cure poison. Yep, this root was once thought to be an antidote to everything from venomous snake bites to bubonic plague. The name Scorzonera might even come from Scorzone, Italian for viper. If that doesn't scream medieval hype, I don't know what does. You can almost picture the scene. A monk in a hillside cloister, leaning over a manuscript illuminated with curling vines and golden ink, meticulously recording the preparation of Scorzonera decoctions, while someone in the background screams about plague symptoms. Was it effective? Honestly, probably not. But the placebo effect is real, and when your town is losing half its population, you'll try anything, including root soup. Aside from its medicinal reputation, Scorzonera earned a solid spot in the kitchens of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was peeled, boiled, sautéed, and even mashed. When cooked right, it takes on a texture somewhere between a roasted parsnip and a firm artichoke heart. Add butter and herbs, and it's genuinely delicious. But the prep is a pain. The roots exude a sticky, milky sap that gums up your fingers and knives, making peeling an exercise in patience and stubbornness. Modern cooks used to bagged baby carrots and triple-wash spinach would probably quit halfway through. That's a big part of why Scorzonera faded into obscurity. It demands attention, not the spotlight, just your time. And in a post-industrial world that prioritizes speed and uniformity, vegetables like this get the axe. Literally. Too messy, too slow, too inconsistent in size. Try putting Scorzonera through a mechanized peeling machine, and you'll get a mess. Try shipping it cross-country, and it'll arrive looking like charcoal spaghetti. It doesn't scale, and in agriculture, not scaling is a sin. There's another thing. It got overshadowed by its cousin, Salsify. That root is similar, just paler, with a lighter flavour and a shorter name. For whatever reason, maybe branding, maybe easier prep, Salsify edged Scorzonera out of many gardens by the 1800s. You know you're deep in vegetable trivia when one obscure root vegetable gets upstaged by an even slightly less obscure root vegetable. Still, Scorzonera never totally disappeared. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean it clung on like the culinary cockroach it is. Farmers grew it in quiet rebellion against monocultures. Grandmothers passed it down like family jewellery. Peel carefully, boil slowly, and don't forget the lemon juice so it doesn't turn grey. In recent years it's even shown up in the odd fancy restaurant, dressed up in foam and microgreens like it belongs. And honestly, it kind of does. You pull up one of the roots, it resists a bit but finally gives with a satisfying pop. It's about the length of your forearm and coated in dirt that clings like it's not ready to let go. You hold it in your hand and imagine it washed, peeled and slowly roasted in butter. The smell would be rich, slightly nutty, almost floral. This is food that tastes like memory, even if you've never had it before. Of course, there's a nerdy debate in botanical circles over whether Scorzonera and Salsify should be treated as separate crops, or just variants of the same ancient root lineage. Some argue that their distinct Latin names, Scorzonera hispanica versus Tragopagon porifolius, are evidence enough of their difference. Others insist that culinary use and cultivation patterns blur the lines, and that even the historical texts weren't clear on which was which. But the fact that we're even having that debate tells you something. These roots mattered. They were important enough to argue over. As you turn the root in your hand, the garden around you hums with quiet life. You're beginning to see the pattern. These aren't just weird vegetables lost to time. They're casualties of progress measured only by speed and profit. Scorzonera didn't die because it failed us. We just got tired of working for flavour. Still, there's something deeply satisfying about a food that makes you slow down. You can't rush Scorzonera. You have to peel it carefully, cook it gently, and give it the kind of attention your taste buds forgot they deserved. In a world of instant everything, that alone might be revolutionary. You place the root beside a growing pile of forgotten plants, and your gaze shifts to a dense, bushy patch near the edge of the garden. The leaves are soft and round, and the whole plant sways gently like it's always lived near water. This is mallow, and while it sounds like it belongs in a bag of campfire snacks, it has a slippery, soothing past you're about to step right into. You walk toward the edge of the garden, where things start to look a little less manicured and a little more wild, overgrown, looser, untamed. There, in a soft tangle of leaves and stems, you find a low, bushy plant that looks like it might have wandered in from some marshy creek bank. The stems are slightly fuzzy, the leaves round and crinkled like tiny green saucers, and here and there pale pink-purple flowers peek out like shy little secrets. You crouch down and run your hand through the patch. The leaves are soft, velvety, a bit cool. This is mallow, and yes, this is where marshmallows came from. Sort of. Let's get this out of the way early. No, this plant will not taste like a toasted s'more. But the connection is real. The roots of mallow, especially the marsh variety, were once boiled down to create a thick, gooey sap, a natural mucilage. In ancient Egypt, and later in medieval Europe, that sap was whipped with honey and dried into a sweet, chewy confection that eventually evolved into the air-puffed sugar bombs we know today. But back then, it was less about dessert and more about medicine. Because mallow wasn't just edible, it was healing. You pluck a leaf and pinch it between your fingers. It releases a faint scent, grassy and herbal, with a slippery feel when you rub it. That's the mucilage, and medieval herbalists prized it. Mallow leaves, stems and roots were used to soothe sore throats, calm irritated stomachs, and treat inflamed skin. The Romans used it. So did Islamic scholars, and during the Middle Ages, it was one of the go-to plants in monastic gardens and cottage herb beds. If something hurt, mallow probably had a place in the treatment plan, but it wasn't just medicine. Mallow was also food. The leaves, when young, are tender and mild, good for soups, stews, or even eaten raw. Cooked, they thicken broth the same way okra does, giving it a rich, velvety texture. In fact, some culinary historians suspect okra might have stolen mallow's thunder. Mallow was widely eaten throughout Europe until the introduction of okra from Africa and the East Indies, which brought a similar texture with a flashier profile and a higher yield. And here's the quirky part. Mallow was once considered a virtuous food, not just healthy, but morally good. In classical philosophy, it was praised for its simplicity and moderation. Pliny the Elder wrote about it. So did Galen. To eat mallow was to align yourself with nature, with balance, with inner peace, which is kind of wild considering we now associate its distant mutated descendant with cavity-inducing marshmallow cereal. But again, like the others, mallow's downfall came with industrialization. It doesn't fit into neat agricultural categories. It grows best in marginal land. Ditches, riverbanks, even roadsides. It doesn't look great on a plate. The leaves wilt quickly. The stems can be stringy. And the mucilage, once prized for healing, now makes most people recoil. Slimy, they call it. Strange. And just like that, it went from medicinal marvel to unwanted weed. There's still a bit of a food fight happening in the scholarly world about mallow's place in culinary history. Some argue it was always a famine food, something you turned to when you were desperate. Others say that's a modern rewrite and that mallow was genuinely enjoyed, especially when harvested young and prepared properly. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. It was nourishing, yes, but it was also reliable, not flashy, not glamorous, just there, year after year, sprouting up where other plants gave up. You nibble a tiny piece of leaf. It's mild, almost flavourless, with a slippery finish. Not exactly thrilling, but you get it. This was a utility plant, a thickener, a stomach soother, a background player in the daily drama of survival. You imagine a pot of barley stew in a tiny cottage, a handful of mallow leaves tossed in to stretch it out to add some green in the depths of winter. No one would write a poem about it, but without it, that stew might have been too thin, too bland, too little. Mallow, in all its forms, is still around, but like many of its medieval cousins, it's gone feral. You've probably passed it growing in sidewalk cracks or along forgotten fences, and unless you're a forager, you've probably ignored it. That's the fate of many ancient vegetables. They didn't go extinct, they just stopped being seen. You look around and spot a few bees hovering over the flowers, they know mallow's worth. Pollinators love it, and some permaculture advocates are trying to bring it back, not just for its edibility but for its ecosystem value. Mallow provides ground cover, stabilizes soil, attracts insects, and demands nothing in return. It's a quiet kind of sustainability, the kind that existed long before the word sustainability became marketable. And maybe that's what makes its erasia so frustrating. Mallow didn't ask for much, but in a world that rewards volume, beauty, and novelty, it just couldn't compete. It was too subtle, too slimy, too useful in ways that didn't generate a barcode. You stand again, wiping your hands on your pants, and look out over the growing collection of forgotten greens. It's like building a memory from dirt, a salad made of ghosts. You're not even halfway through, but already your modern grocery store feels like a parody of abundance. A dozen greens, all curated for crunch, shelf life, and aesthetics, and none of them with half the stories of what's growing in this dirt. Just to your left, another patch is beginning to flower, feathery fern-like leaves catching the light, with the faintest hint of licorice on the breeze. That's Chervil, elegant, ephemeral, and almost entirely missing from the modern table. Let's go meet it. You drift toward the edge of the mallow patch. brushing its soft leaves one last time before your gaze is caught by something lighter, daintier, almost ornamental. A delicate mist of green feathers out from the soil, looking more like the trim of a fancy herb bouquet than anything you'd expect to find thriving in a medieval garden. The stems are thin and wiry, the leaves finely divided like lacy parsley but more elegant. You lean in and immediately catch the scent, subtle, sweet, with just a whisper of anise. This is Chervil, and if herbs had social classes, this one would definitely be wearing silk gloves and giving you unsolicited advice on how to flavour white fish. Chervil was once the darling of herb gardens. A soft-spoken cousin of parsley, it was considered refined, medicinal, and just the right amount of mysterious. Medieval cooks didn't reach for it when they wanted to bludgeon a dish with flavour. They used it to add nuance. It was the herb for those who noticed things. A bit of greenery folded into eggs, or stirred into a light broth right before serving. Too much heat, and it loses its flavour. Too much time, and it wilts into nothing. Chervil was for the careful cook, the one who paid attention. You pluck a small sprig and roll it between your fingers. The scent is charming, delicate, vaguely reminiscent of tarragon but gentler. You taste it, and for a second you get why it once held a spot in nearly every monastic garden from Canterbury to Cologne. It's sweet, herbal, fresh. But it fades fast. This is not an herb that lingers. It's here, it says hello, and then it leaves. The ghost of flavour. Back in medieval kitchens, Chervil was used not only to flavour, but to heal. It was believed to purify the blood, aid digestion, and even act as an early spring tonic. Something you'd add to your food after a long, salt-preserved winter to remind your body that freshness was coming back. The roots were also edible, though much milder than the foliage, and often boiled like tiny parsnips. The whole plant was seen as restorative, gentle and safe. Even now, some herbalists swear by Chervil infusions for their calming properties. It's like the chamomile of the culinary world. And yet, despite its pedigree, Chervil slowly vanished from most kitchens. Why? Well, that's where the story turns frustratingly familiar. First, it's delicate. You can't freeze it or dry it without killing the flavour. It's one of those herbs that must be used fresh. Which is romantic in theory, but in the world of food logistics it's a death sentence. It bruises easily. It doesn't last long after harvest. It hates travel. So as food networks globalised and efficiency became king, Chervil's name quietly slid off shopping lists. Then there's the flavour. Modern palates, trained on garlic, chilli and processed umami, often overlook herbs like Chervil. It's just too soft. It doesn't punch you in the face. It lifts. It glides. It suggests. And in a culinary world that rewards boldness and extremes, suggestion doesn't sell. Some scholars argue that Chervil's decline is also a casualty of changing herb preferences during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment culinary shifts. As French cuisine formalised under chefs like Carême and Escoffier, parsley, thyme, and bay leaf got canonised into classics like bouquet garni. Chervil was left off the list, not because it wasn't good, but because it didn't fit the new rules. So despite having a long European history, including usage in Roman and Byzantine kitchens, it got edited out of the mainstream narrative. There's also a bit of confusion with other herbs. People often mistake Chervil for flat-leaf parsley, or even young carrot greens, and because it doesn't slap you with flavour like basil or sage, it tends to get lumped in with filler herbs, a garnish, an afterthought. You can almost hear the injustice in its rustling leaves. It didn't choose to be delicate. But here's a fun fringe fact. In parts of Germany and Austria, Chervil is still part of a tradition known as Gründonnerstag-Suppe, Green Thursday soup, served on the Thursday before Easter. The soup is made with 7 spring herbs, and Chervil almost always makes the cut. It's symbolic, seasonal, and meant to cleanse both body and soul. This tiny herb may not dominate dinner plates, but in certain rituals it still holds power. You kneel down and dig your fingers gently into the soil. The Chervil plants here are thriving, lush, happy, gently swaying in the breeze like they know they're being noticed for the first time in centuries. You imagine a medieval cook gathering a few sprigs at dawn, careful not to bruise the leaves, slipping them into a linen pouch to carry back to the manor kitchen. She knows the soup needs something light to balance the salt pork. Not everyone will notice, but the ones who do, They'll smile. There's a lesson in Chervil. It's not just about what survives, but how. It didn't storm into modern kitchens. It didn't scream to stay. It just faded, quietly, the way steam disappears from a cooling pot. Still there in the cracks, in the seed catalogues you have to email 3 times to access, in the gardens of the quietly determined. You stand up, brushing dirt from your hands, and glance toward the next plot. It looks wild, thick, spiny, and oddly succulent. A strange hybrid of vegetable and sea creature, all gnarled stems and salty attitude. You walk toward it, hearing the crunch of sand beneath your feet. Welcome to Samphire. This one tastes like the ocean, and it used to be everywhere. You walk slowly toward the next patch, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath your feet. Less loamy now, more gravelly, as if even the soil knows it's getting closer to the sea. The air sharpens too, with a briny tang that makes you breathe a little deeper, instinctively. And then you see it. A low, succulent-like plant crawling across the sandy bed like it's trying not to be noticed. Thick, finger-like stalks reach upward in clusters, bright green with a hint of gloss, like they've been misted with salt water. You pluck one gently, and even before you taste it, you know, it smells like the coast. This is samphire, also called sea asparagus, sea pickle, or, in older text, glasswort. We'll get to that. Samphire is one of those plants that's technically still alive in the modern culinary world. Barely, but it lives on the margins. It's a relic, both of medieval diets and of a time when humans and the sea had a very different relationship. One where salt wasn't just seasoning, it was survival. One where gathering food didn't stop at the shoreline. You bring the stalk to your lips and bite down, crunch. Immediately it floods your mouth with flavour, briny, bright, a little like biting into a caper that grew legs. There's a snap to it, a clean finish, and a salty kick that makes your tongue stand up and salute. It's not subtle. Samphire is what some might call aggressively coastal, and that's exactly why it was once so valuable. In the Middle Ages, especially along the coast of Britain and France, samphire was foraged in early summer from cliffs and salt marshes. It was dangerous work. Harvesters would lower themselves by rope to gather it from rocky outcroppings, hauling baskets full of the stuff to sell in market towns. Shakespeare even references it in King Lear. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire. Dreadful trade. He wasn't kidding. But people did it, year after year. Why? Because samphire wasn't just a garnish. It was pickled, preserved, and used throughout the year to add flavour to otherwise dull food. Think medieval sauerkraut's sexy, briny cousin. And here's the wild fringe fact. Samphire used to be burned for its ash, which was then used in the production of glass. That's where the name glasswort comes from. Before industrial soda ash, plant ashes were essential to glassmaking, and salty plants like samphire produced the alkaline materials needed to melt sand into clarity. So yes, this humble sea veggie helped medieval Europe see through windows. Kind of a big deal. In terms of food, samphire was both practical and delightful. It thrived where nothing else would. It was one of the few greens you could gather fresh from the coast, and once pickled, it added a sharp, salty brightness to the medieval table, something desperately needed when most food was boiled beyond recognition and preserved within an inch of its life. A little pile of samphire next to a slab of salted pork or a dense barley loaf was the culinary equivalent of a lime wedge today. Not essential, but once you've had it, you don't want to go back. But of course, samphire didn't stand a chance once agriculture moved away from foraging and into rows and rows of predictably behaved plants. Samphire doesn't like being told what to do. It grows where it wants. Coastal margins, salt marshes, tidal flats. It laughs in the face of irrigation. Try domesticating it and it sulks. Try growing it inland and it withers. It's one of those plants that insists on being wild. That doesn't vibe with mass production, shipping logistics, or the gentle shelves of a suburban grocery store. Today, if you do find samphire, it's likely in an upscale seafood restaurant, possibly perched dramatically atop a scallop or tucked next to some artistically seared halibut. It's expensive, rare, and usually served in comically small portions. It has, ironically, become a luxury food, and yet for centuries it was the stuff of peasants and fishermen. The poor man's pickle, eaten because it was there, not because it had a PR team. There's a bit of debate about which version of Samphire is the true one. What grows in salt marshes is often called marsh samphire, Salicornia europea, while another bushier variety that grows on cliffs is known as rock samphire, Crythmum maritimum. Rock samphire has a more pungent flavour, almost citrusy, and was more common in older recipes. But modern chefs have leaned toward the crunchier, less intense marsh type. Botanists argue about taxonomy. Chefs argue about texture. Meanwhile, Samphire continues doing its thing on the edge of the world, unimpressed. You imagine a medieval coastal town at low tide, the smell of seaweed thick in the air, and barefoot foragers picking stalks of samphire to toss into brine jars. A few miles inland, someone is lighting a fire, boiling down seawater and salt-tolerant plants into ash, feeding it into the village glassmaker's furnace. Food and craft, preservation and progress, all tied to a strange little plant that tastes like the ocean punched you in the mouth and said, "You're welcome." Samphire reminds you that not all vegetables were meant to be tamed. Some are seasonal, hyper-local, and best experienced with mud on your boots and wind in your face. It asks you to taste not just salt, but place. And maybe that's the point of all these forgotten greens. They weren't just ingredients. They were geography, climate, history, the flavour of where you were. You crunch another stalk and wipe your hands on your pants, the salt lingering on your fingertips. Just beyond the samphire, there's a small, bushy green with soft, rounded leaves that form tight little rosettes. At first glance, it looks like a weed. But this one is lamb's lettuce, one of Europe's oldest salad greens and possibly the most tragically underrated plant in this entire garden. You step away from the coast-hugging samphire patch and walk toward a quieter corner of the garden, where the plants seem lower to the ground, more self-contained, almost shy. There's a stillness here, not the rugged defiance of Scorzonera or the seaside swagger of Samphire, but something gentler. You crouch down next to a patch of soft green rosettes, each about the size of a small teacup, growing close to the soil like they're trying not to be noticed. The leaves are spoon-shaped, tender, and a deep velvety green. You reach down, pick one, and bite. It's delicate, mild, a whisper of flavour with the tiniest touch of nuttiness at the end. This is lamb's lettuce, also known as corn salad, mache, field salad, or by its more medieval name, Valerinella locusta. Now here's the thing. Lamb's lettuce isn't entirely forgotten. You can find it, if you try hard enough, in fancy salad mixes or in the posh corners of European farmers' markets. But even then, it's usually playing second fiddle to arugula or baby spinach. You never see it headlining, never starring. Which is a shame, because in the medieval world, lamb's lettuce was the winter green. A quiet powerhouse that kept people fed and scurvy-free when everything else was dead or buried under snow. You run your fingers through the cluster of leaves. It's astonishing how soft they are. Like a baby's cheek. Lamb's lettuce thrived in cool weather. Too cool for most other greens to grow. It wasn't cultivated in neat rows, not at first. It grew wild in grain fields and fallow land, and people simply gathered it when they found it. It earned the name lamb's lettuce, not because lambs ate it, though they might have, but because it tended to grow in pastures where lambs grazed in early spring. It was one of the first signs of edible life returning after a bleak, root-heavy winter. You picture a medieval peasant woman walking the edge of a field at dawn, basket in hand, frost still clinging to the grass, gathering these tender greens for the pot. Maybe she tosses them into a broth with leeks and barley. Maybe she eats them fresh with vinegar and oil, simple, nourishing, almost shockingly modern. This plant gave early spring a softness, a hint of colour when everything else was grey, and for centuries it stayed that way. Modest, reliable, seasonal. But like so many of its plant siblings, lamb's lettuce didn't keep its place. The Industrial Revolution shifted farming toward large-scale grain production and field spraying, and what was once a helpful weed became an inconvenience. Herbicides wiped it out. Uniform planting schedules ignored it, and modern supermarkets, with their year-round obsession for the same 5 greens, didn't have room for something this tender and seasonal. Still, lamb's lettuce tried to hang on. In parts of France, particularly in the Loire Valley, it was kept alive through family gardens and small farms. In Germany too, it remained a local winter staple, often, served with crispy bacon, potatoes and a mustardy vinaigrette. But elsewhere, It slipped through the cracks. It didn't ship well. It didn't store well. And it didn't sell well. Not in the quantities that made supermarkets happy. By the time the 20th century rolled around, it had been effectively sidelined. There's a fringe movement, of course, a group of slow food advocates and heirloom gardeners who champion lamb's lettuce as a symbol of seasonal eating. They love it for what it is, a plant that reminds you of what time of year it is, not because a label tells you, but because your tongue does. A green that tastes like early spring, like something fresh and shy, like the first day you don't have to wear a coat. There's a fun bit of medieval trivia here too. Lamb's lettuce was once used in love potions, not because it was particularly magical, but because of its reputation for being both gentle and vital. Something about its tender leaves and early arrival made people think of renewal, hope, fertility. You'd find it in herbal almanacs listed among the greening plants, those believed to bring energy back to the body after winter's long grip. You sit for a moment next to the patch, watching the way the leaves catch the light. They don't flaunt. They don't push upward like kale or burst with colour like beet greens. Lamb's lettuce is quiet, unassuming, but it gives you something deeper. Presence. It's a plant that makes you slow down, that tells you, here, now, this is what the earth is offering. No hothouses, no imports, just what's ready. And yes, you can still find it in seed catalogues, though it's often labelled with one of its many aliases: mache, corn salad, field lettuce. Each name tells a part of the story. Corn salad comes from its habit of growing in grain fields. Mache is the French term that got imported to the US during one of the few moments American cuisine flirted with seasonal elegance. But whatever you call it, it remains one of the softest revolutions you can eat. A green that doesn't shout but lingers. There's an ongoing debate in culinary circles about why lamb's lettuce never took off the way arugula did. Some say it's because it doesn't bring enough flavour to stand out. Others argue it's too fragile, more of a sensory experience than a functional one. But a third group, the romantics, say lamb's lettuce never needed to take off. It stayed rooted. It didn't want to be mass-produced. It wanted to be gathered. You stand again and brush the soil off your hands. The patch stretches out in neat, humble rows, whispering of frost and patience. And just ahead, another herb waves in the breeze, taller now, with frilly leaves and a scent that hits your nose before you even reach it. Anise? No. Sweeter. Rounder. It smells like dessert dressed as a plant. Welcome to Sicily, your new favourite herb. If only you'd heard of it before. You leave behind the tender rosettes of lamb's lettuce, your fingers still carrying that soft grassy scent, and walk toward the part of the garden where the air smells noticeably sweeter. There's a shift in the breeze here, like a whiff of licorice, sugar and crushed green stems, all mingling together in some kind of herbal dessert fantasy. You follow your nose until you find it. A tall, graceful plant with finely divided leaves, soft and frilly like the fluff on an over-decorated wedding cake. You brush your hand through the foliage and catch another wave of that unmistakable sweetness. This is sweet Sicily. And right away, you know this one had no business being forgotten. It smells like candy. Or maybe like the idea of candy before we turned it into corn syrup and neon. Sicily was once a staple of European herb gardens, especially in northern and central Europe, where sugar was rare and expensive, but people still had sweet teeth. Long before sugar bowls sat on every table, plants like this were the shortcut. You wanted your apple pie to taste a little brighter? Throw in Sicily. You needed something to take the edge off sour gooseberries or rhubarb? Sicily to the rescue. You pluck a leaf and taste it. The texture is soft but not floppy, and the flavour hits you with a wave of sweetness and anise, like fennel without the burn, or black licorice that decided to go gentle. It's wild, really, that something this pleasant has slipped almost entirely out of culinary fashion. But of course, it has. Because sweet Sicily doesn't play by modern rules. It's a slow grower. It likes partial shade, moist soil, and a long-term relationship. You can't just toss some seeds in dry dirt and expect results. Sicily demands patience. Worse still, its seeds don't stay viable for long. They need to be planted fresh, right after ripening, or they lose their ability to sprout. From a commercial standpoint, that's a nightmare. There's no easy mass packaging, no long shelf life. And since the flavour is subtle, modern chefs mostly ignore it. in favour of louder, flashier herbs. But back in medieval times, Sicily was beloved. It was used in everything from herbal tonics to desserts, and was especially treasured in the spring. After a long winter of dried roots and salted meat, the bright green leaves of Sicily were a symbol of renewal. Monks used it to flavour cordials. Housewives folded it into cakes, fruit tarts, and early puddings. And herbalists, they practically worshipped it. Sweet Sicily was considered good for digestion, great for chest complaints, and even a gentle stimulant. Plus, as an added bonus, its roots were edible, something like a parsnip soaked in anise. You walk farther into the patch and notice the flowers, delicate, white, and arranged in airy umbels like lace against the greenery. If you didn't know better, you'd mistake it for a wildflower, and actually that's part of the problem. In some places, Sweet Sicily has been branded as invasive. It escapes cultivation and naturalizes quickly, especially in moist woodland edges. In fact, in parts of North America, where it was introduced centuries ago, it now grows wild along riverbanks and trails, completely ignored by modern foragers who have no idea what it is. You crouch and rub one of the seeds between your fingers. It's long and ridged like a tiny canoe. Smells just as sweet as the leaves. These were once chewed like candy. Seriously. Imagine a time when a child's treat wasn't something wrapped in foil but plucked straight from a backyard patch of herbs. That was Sicily's place in the world. Sweet, accessible, slightly magical. And here's a quirky little fact. Some early texts claimed Sweet Sicily could ward off melancholy, not in a dramatic curse-breaking way, but in that gentle, tonic-like way of herbs that coax the nervous system into remembering how to relax. There's something kind about this plant, even in its chemistry. It doesn't push, it nudges. The debate among scholars now is whether Sicily's disappearance was purely about logistics or taste. Some claim the rise of cheap sugar rendered it unnecessary. Once sweetness was available by the sack, who needed a leafy shortcut? Others argue that the real reason Sicily disappeared is because it lived in a space that modern cuisine no longer occupies. Subtle enhancement. We don't build flavours gradually anymore. We douse. We blast. We look for the fastest way to hit dopamine. Sicily, with its quiet complexity, just couldn't keep up. You reach down and unearth part of a root. It's thick, tan, and surprisingly long. Washed and boiled, it was once eaten like a vegetable. Mildly sweet with a licorice tang that made it pair beautifully with creamy sauces and roasted meats. But when's the last time you saw a recipe call for Sicily root? Probably never. It's vanished from most cookbooks, left behind in dusty herbals and nostalgic seed catalogues no one reads unless they're planning a 15th century reenactment. Still, Sicily's not extinct. You can grow it if you're patient. Some wild food lovers are bringing it back, sneaking it into desserts, herb blends, and even modern cocktails. It's got a devoted, if tiny, fan base. But it's not in the mainstream. And maybe that's okay. Maybe Sicily's not meant for the mainstream. It asks you to slow down, to smell and taste and pay attention. It's not fast food. It's not even slow food. It's gentle food. You stand again, brushing sweet anise-scented dust from your fingers. The scent lingers, warming and oddly comforting. If herbs could whisper, Sicily would be the one saying, "You don't have to rush." A strange message coming from a plant that's been all but pushed out of the food system. Or maybe not so strange. Maybe that's exactly what it's trying to say, loudly from the edges. Just a few feet away you see a different kind of plant, spikier, rougher, almost prehistoric looking. The leaves are wide and coarse with deep ridges and they shoot up like they've got somewhere to be. This one's burdock, it's not sweet, it's not dainty. But oh, does it have a story? You move toward the next plant and everything about it feels different from what came before. There's no softness here, no delicate perfume in the air. The stems are tough and sprawling, the leaves enormous, deep green with jagged edges that look like they're waiting to snag your clothes if you get too close. This isn't the refined elegance of Chervil or the sweet whisper of Sicily. This is burdock, rough, rugged, and absolutely unapologetic. The first thing you notice is how aggressively alive it feels. Thick stalks shoot up from the base covered in fuzz. The leaves are massive, bigger than your head, and stretch wide like solar panels soaking up every ounce of light. And then there are the burrs, spiky, clingy seed heads that will latch onto your pants and refuse to let go. These are the plant world's version of Velcro, and for good reason. They actually inspired Velcro. In the 1940s, a Swiss engineer studied burdock burrs under a microscope, noticed how their tiny hooks clung to fabric and fur and mimicked the design. So yes, this medieval vegetable helped invent modern fastening technology. Bet your supermarket carrots can't say that. But burdock's not just a walking fun fact. It was once a staple of diets across Europe and Asia, especially in the leaner months. The root, long and pale brown, grows deep into the soil, absorbing minerals like it's hoarding them. You pull one up with a grunt. It's heavy, almost like lifting a baton carved from earth. Washed and sliced, it looks a little like parsnip, but with a denser texture and a more complex smell. Earthy, nutty, with a faint whiff of something medicinal. You bite a raw sliver out of curiosity. It's crunchy, with a flavour that's somewhere between Salsify and celery root, but with a slightly bitter undertone. Not unpleasant, just real. Cook it though, especially sautéed or simmered in broth, and it mellows into something sweet and satisfying. In Japanese cuisine, it's still widely eaten, known as gobo, often shredded into stir-fries or simmered with soy sauce and sesame oil. But in medieval Europe, it was boiled, roasted, mashed into soups, or even pickled. Burdock wasn't flashy. It was foundational. You picture a 14th century kitchen hearth, a pot hanging over the fire, and inside, burdock root chunks bubbling away with wild garlic, barley, and the odd scrap of meat. This was food you could count on. It kept well, grew in tough soil, and was practically immune to neglect. In an age where famine was a season, and not a surprise, burdock was insurance. But like many things that grow too well, burdock's usefulness eventually worked against it. As industrial agriculture took hold, the traits that made burdock resilient, its deep taproots, aggressive spread, and tendency to reseed everywhere, got it labelled as a weed. By the 19th century, farmers were pulling it out of fields, not planting it. It was too unruly, too messy, too wild. And here's the fringe detail that takes this from overlooked root to weird historical gem. Burdock wasn't just a food or a nuisance, it was also used in magic. In folk traditions from England to the Balkans, burdock was believed to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. The burrs were sometimes sewn into clothing as protective charms. The roots were carried as talismans, and in some traditions, boiled burdock water was used in ritual purification baths. So yes, in addition to feeding you, burdock was also out here protecting your aura. But now, burdock barely registers. Outside of niche Asian groceries or wild foraging guides, most people wouldn't know what to do with it. In the West, it's been almost completely erased from the vegetable landscape, and it's not because it doesn't grow. Burdock will happily take over any abandoned lot or roadside ditch if given the chance. It's still around, still thriving, just not invited to dinner anymore. Scholars debate whether this disappearance was purely about farming practicality, or if it was also aesthetic. Burdock isn't pretty, it's not compact or easily trimmed. The roots are long, dirty, hard to harvest. The leaves take up space, and those burrs, total nightmare for machinery. You can't ship it without mess, you can't store it long without flavour loss, and you definitely can't brand it with cartoon characters to make it kid-friendly. But there's a growing group of herbalists and permaculturists trying to change that. Burdock is being reclaimed not just as food, but as medicine. Its roots are said to be detoxifying, supporting the liver, cleansing the blood, promoting healthy skin. In Japan, it's not just a vegetable, it's health food. And in small permaculture gardens, it's being used to break up compacted soil, drawing nutrients up from the subsoil and feeding other plants. It's a team player, just not the kind that fits in neat rows. You hold the root in your hand, feeling its weight. It's not delicate. It doesn't smell sweet or beg to be noticed, but it's solid, real. It feels like something that wants to feed you, not impress you, not market to you, just nourish you. And in a way, that's what all these forgotten vegetables have in common. They weren't trying to be stars, they were just there, steady, generous. You look down again at the sprawling patch of burdock, its wide leaves catching the light like battered shields. This plant didn't vanish. It just got rebranded as trouble. Too big, too bitter, too alive. But the soil still knows what it is. And maybe that's enough. Just beyond, you notice a plant growing in a tight, upright clump. Tall, green, and unmistakably proud. The scent hits you before the name does. Sharp, savoury, and bold. This is lovage. The plant that smells like soup stock and was once the culinary equivalent of shouting in Latin. You leave the thick-leaved burdock patch behind, its spiny burrs still clinging to the hem of your pants like it's refusing to be forgotten. As you move toward the next section of the garden, a strong, unmistakable aroma wafts toward you. Savoury, bold, and oddly familiar. You sniff the air again. It's like someone just opened a fresh bouillon cube and tossed it into the breeze. There's no mistaking it. This is lovage. At first glance, it looks like oversized celery on a bit of a power trip. Tall, proud stems shoot straight up from the ground, some reaching chest height. The leaves are glossy and deeply serrated, arranged in clusters that fan out like little green explosions. You run your fingers through the foliage, and the scent grows stronger. Not just celery, but something deeper, peppery, herbal, with a trace of yeasty richness that makes your mouth water before you even taste it. Lovage doesn't whisper, it announces itself. You break off a small piece of leaf and pop it in your mouth. Immediately your brain says, soup. It's uncanny. The flavour is sharp, savoury, and wildly concentrated. Think celery if it had studied abroad, gotten a degree in culinary drama and came back with opinions. The stems are edible too, hollow like their modern cousin, but stronger in flavour and thicker in texture. The seeds, like herbal seasoning bombs, spicy, aromatic, used to flavour breads, pickles, and even liqueurs in parts of Eastern Europe. It's strange to think a plant this flavourful, this useful, could disappear. But it did. Once a common kitchen garden staple across Europe, lovage has largely vanished from everyday cooking, quietly exiled to herb nerd forums and seed catalogues printed on recycled parchment. But in the Middle Ages, it was a heavy hitter. Lovage was used in everything from meat pies to medicinal tonics. Its flavour held up against strong ingredients like salted pork, fermented dairy, and heavy grains, all staples of the medieval diet. If your broth was bland, toss in lovage. If your stew needed bite, lovage again. If your breath was questionable after a meal of garlic and onions, lovage seeds, chewed like fennel. It was the herb that did everything and made it look easy. You kneel down beside a particularly vibrant cluster of it, and you can't help but wonder, how did something this versatile get booted from the kitchen? It checks all the boxes: perennial, low maintenance, hardy, flavourful. But, as always, the answer lies in packaging, patience, and public perception. Lovage doesn't look delicate. It doesn't scream gourmet. It grows big and unruly, takes up space, and smells intensely herbal even when you're 10 feet away. Supermarkets don't like that. Neither do small fridges. When celery was refined and bred into the mild, watery, stringless version we have today, it outshone lovage simply by being more manageable, more photogenic, less opinionated. There's another complication. Lovage seeds don't germinate reliably, and the plant takes a while to establish. That's a red flag for modern agriculture. Today's food system wants fast, predictable, repeatable crops. Lovage? It's the guy who shows up late to the meeting but has all the answers once he gets there. Brilliant but inconvenient. Still, it hung on in corners of Europe. In Romanian and Polish cooking, you'll still find it flavouring soups and stews, especially around Easter. In some regions of Germany and Austria, lovage is called Magikraut, a reference to a popular brand of soup seasoning that mimics its flavour. That's right. They invented a mass-market product to copy the taste of the thing they stopped growing. That might be the most modern food irony imaginable. And here's your quirky fact of the day. In medieval medicine, lovage wasn't just a culinary hero. It was believed to be an aphrodisiac and a general stimulator of the passions. It was often included in love potions and bath infusions, particularly those intended to awaken desire or attract a mate. You can practically hear the herbalists whispering, Add 2 sprigs of lovage, one for flavour, one for luck. You didn't just cook with it, you lived with it. There's even a bit of a botanical debate about lovage's true origins. Some argue it descends from wild mountain celery found in the Mediterranean. Others claim it has closer ties to ancient Persia. But either way, it travelled with traders, was written about by the Greeks and Romans, and eventually took root in medieval monastic gardens, where it was valued as both food and remedy. The lines between the two blurred more back then. If it tasted good and cured something, even better. You imagine a pot of thick lentil stew on a smoky hearth, bubbling with onions, garlic and root vegetables, all tied together with a handful of chopped lovage leaves, or maybe a clay bottle of herbal vinegar, steeped with lovage, thyme and mustard seed, ready to be used in a dressing or spooned over meat. This wasn't garnish. This was the foundation. And yet, as flavour preferences flattened and cooking leaned more into neutral, standardised tastes, lovage just didn't fit. It was too strong, too assertive. It wasn't trying to blend in. It wanted to lead. And that kind of flavour doesn't always survive in a world of beige casseroles and flavourless broths. You take one more deep inhale of the plant, and it's intoxicating in its own way. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it laughing at how underappreciated it's become. It's still here, growing tall and lush, giving everything it's got with zero fanfare. It doesn't need rescuing, just remembering. A breeze rolls through the garden, and you follow it toward another patch, leafier, with tall stalks and a slightly tougher presence. This one looks familiar at first glance. You think it might be kale, but no, not the Instagram darling of modern wellness. This is medieval kale, bigger, brassier, and bred for survival, not aesthetics. You're about to meet the tough ancestor of today's leafy trendsetter. You follow the scent trail left by lovage, bold and bracing, and find yourself standing before a cluster of tall, broad-leafed plants that practically shout, "I'm edible," in the language of rugged survivability. At first glance you think, oh, kale, but the leaves are thicker, darker, and more sprawling. There's no manicured baby leaf here, no frilly designer edges, no fluorescent packaging claiming this will boost your smoothie game. This is the original, the rough draft. Medieval kale, also called boar coal in its older form, a hardy, fibrous, no-nonsense plant that's seen more winters than you've had hot showers. You run your hand over a leaf, and it doesn't give much. It's got that tough, leathery texture of a plant that's not here for your convenience, and why would it be? This kale predates your blender by centuries. It grew in tiny cottage gardens, castle fields, monastery beds, anywhere the soil wasn't actively on fire. It didn't need much coddling. It thrived in the cold, laughed at frost, and kept growing when everything else curled up and died. It was less a vegetable and more a green-tinged dare. You snap off a piece and chew it raw. It resists, then releases a deep, slightly bitter flavour. Not unpleasant, but assertive. There's no babying your taste buds here. You get iron, earth, something that tastes a little like survival. Cook it, preferably for a long time with fat, onions and maybe a splash of vinegar, and it transforms into something tender, nourishing, even comforting. But that transformation takes work, and work, as you've probably picked up by now, is not something modern agriculture loves. Medieval kale was everywhere in Europe, especially in the cooler northern climates where growing much else in winter was a stretch. In some places, it was eaten nearly daily during the cold months. It was shredded into soups, layered into meat pies, braised with barley and sometimes eaten on its own, if you were poor or between livestock. It wasn't just another leafy green, it was the backbone of winter meals, the thing that kept people from starving between the last potato and the first apple. And yet, somehow, it got pushed to the sidelines. How does a vegetable that can grow through a blizzard get sidelined, you ask? Well, the story's part marketing, part aesthetics, and part human stubbornness. Over time, as vegetable breeding focused on ease and appearance, kale was transformed. Its leaves were made smaller, its bitterness bred out, and it was tailored to fit salad bags and Instagram filters. Enter baby kale, the modern version. Softer, sweeter, and about as close to this original form as a golden retriever is to a wolf. What's wild is that while kale is now considered a superfood in many circles, the version people obsess over is basically a toned-down echo of what this plant used to be. Medieval kale was richer in iron, calcium and vitamin C. it was packed with fibre, and yes, it was bitter, because bitterness, in small doses, is part of what tells your body a food is nutritious. That was the plant's defence mechanism, and our ancestors simply dealt with it. A long cook in broth, a few onions, maybe a chunk of salted meat, and boom, you had a nutrient-dense meal that didn't need a marketing team. You kneel and examine the stem. It's thick, almost woody, with veins like rivulets branching across each massive leaf. These plants weren't meant to be harvested young and dainty, they were meant to endure, and that's exactly what they did. Until the industrial food system decided endurance wasn't profitable. Another quirky little fact. In parts of Scotland and the Netherlands, kale was grown not just for humans, but as winter fodder for livestock. And because of its resilience, it was often planted in shared village plots or along the edges of farms where other crops failed. In some places, the appearance of young kale shoots in early spring was a cause for local celebration, a literal sign that you had made it through another hungry season. There's some scholarly debate over when exactly kale started being bred for looks over function. Some say the process began in the 18th century, when gardening manuals started emphasising form as well as flavour. Others point to the Victorian obsession with ornamental cabbage and kale, grown not for food, but for decorative use in flower beds, because nothing says imperial priorities like using edible plants to colour coordinate your lawn. But maybe the strangest twist in this plant's journey is its modern status as a health icon. Kale chips, kale smoothies, kale patches on celebrity t-shirts. It's ironic, really. After being kicked out of most dinner plates for being too tough, kale had to put on a new costume to be welcomed back. We had to soften it, shrink it, and dress it up with buzzwords like detox, cleanse, and plant-based powerhouse, before we were willing to give it a second look. You stand and look out across the patch, seeing not just plants, but resilience. These leaves fed peasants, monks, soldiers, and sailors. They lived through frost and famine, through centuries of war and peace. They were chopped, boiled, pickled, and praised in herbal texts as restorative, strengthening, and, yes, even medicinal. This kale didn't need your approval, it already knew its worth. You pull one large leaf and hold it up. It's heavy, full, a little rough around the edges. It doesn't care about your expectations. It just is. Honest, durable, functional. Everything you could want from a vegetable. Unless, of course, you're looking for something that fits neatly into a salad spinner. A gust of wind rustles through the garden, and in the distance you see something that looks different. Tidy rows, symmetrical plants, a more organised energy. These are the monastic gardens, the ones that didn't just grow food, but protected it, preserved it, coded it into books and rituals. You're about to step into the part of the story where the greens weren't just for dinner, they were sacred knowledge. You move toward the quieter part of the garden now, where the wind hushes against stone walls and the scent of herbs sharpens into something orderly, like the difference between wild bird song and a cathedral choir. The space feels different here, more structured. You step through an arch of aged, ivy-wrapped wood into what's clearly a monastic garden. The beds are square, symmetrical, and deliberate. There's no chaos here, only care. Each row is lined with purpose, not just aesthetics. You're standing in a place where vegetables were more than food, they were knowledge. Preserved, studied, prayed over. In this garden, you're not just walking among plants. You're walking through the memory of centuries. A monk passes by in your imagination, robes rustling, hands dusty from working the soil, maybe humming a line of chant. His eyes flick over the beds like a doctor checking on patients, and rightly so, because these weren't just cabbages and herbs to the monks. These were medicine, nourishment, and sometimes secrets. The monastic gardens of medieval Europe were the original agricultural think tanks, part farm, part apothecary, part spiritual retreat, and they were crucial in keeping plant knowledge alive through some of the darkest centuries on record. You glance down at a bed of plants and recognise some old friends, Skirret, Chervil, Good King Henry, all growing together like a leafy reunion. In the chaos of history, wars, famines, collapses, these gardens acted like green vaults. Cloistered monasteries tucked into hills and forests were often the only places where ancient horticultural practices were recorded, protected, and passed on. Scrolls and herbals, written in cramped Latin script, sat beside drying bundles of herbs. If a seed had a story, it was the monks who kept it alive. And it wasn't just food they were preserving, it was taxonomy, planting techniques, harvest calendars, grafting experiments, and medicinal recipes. Monastic herbal manuals like the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen or the Leech books from Anglo-Saxon England were part cookbook, part spellbook, part agricultural diary. Through them, plants like Burdock, Lovage, and Mallow weren't just listed as edibles. They were described in terms of humours, divine balance, and moral symbolism. You reach down and pull a stem of Alexanders, growing along the outer border. Its peppery scent cuts through the warm air. The monks didn't see this as just a spice. It was warming in the Galenic sense, a treatment for cold, phlegmatic illnesses. Every plant in this garden served multiple purposes: practical, spiritual, and symbolic. Lovage was believed to bring clarity of speech. Skirret sweetened the blood and the spirit. Mallow soothed both bowels and tempers. But here's where things get weird, in the best way. Some monastic gardens were intentionally designed with mystical geometry in mind. Beds were shaped like crosses, circles within squares, representations of divine order mapped into soil. The very act of gardening was prayerful. Every weed pulled was a sin rooted out, every sprout a resurrection. These weren't just vegetables, they were sermons in chlorophyll. And yet, even here, big agriculture found a way to erase. When monasteries were dissolved, especially in England under Henry VIII, many of these gardens were destroyed or sold off. The scrolls were burned, the plants uprooted, and centuries of quiet green knowledge were scattered. What wasn't lost outright was absorbed and sanitized by later scientific frameworks that separated botany from faith, dismissing centuries of integrated understanding as superstition. There's still a scholarly fight about how much of medieval monastic gardening was scientifically effective versus symbolically layered. Some modern academics argue that much of it was based on pre-scientific nonsense: humour theory, religious allegory, outdated physiology. Others counter that even if the framework was flawed, the practices were often surprisingly effective. Composting, companion planting, biodiversity, seed saving, all fundamentals of sustainable agriculture today, were part of monastic life centuries ago. And maybe that's the point. These gardens didn't just grow food, they grew resilience against disease, scarcity, loss, against forgetfulness. You walk past a raised bed bordered in stones, where Sicily, Chervil, and yarrow wave gently. Above each, a carved wooden stake bears not just the name of the plant, but a small prayer or medicinal note, warming and drying, to be given to the sorrowful. You imagine the monks, reading aloud as they worked, naming the plants, speaking them into usefulness. There's power in that. In one corner you see a half-covered root cellar, its door ajar. Inside, earthy baskets hold dried roots: Scorzonera, Burdock, parsnip, Lovage seed pods. These were kept through the winter, not just as food stores, but as living archives, genetic banks before we even knew what a gene was. Monastic gardens understood something that modern food systems still struggle with: diversity as survival. Monks traded seeds across abbeys like sacred relics. A cutting of a rare herb might travel from a Benedictine monastery in France to a Franciscan outpost in Germany, carried over mountains and rivers, tucked into the sleeve of a friar's robe. These exchanges kept ancient cultivars alive, especially the ones we've now forgotten. And without them, your modern produce aisle would be a ghost town. You pause and look around. There's a feeling in this place, of care, of slowness, of deep intention. These gardens weren't efficient. They weren't optimized for yield or shelf life. They were optimized for meaning. Every plant had a purpose, and often more than one: food, medicine, ritual. This kale wasn't just for soup. It was for strength, for penance, for the long wait between winter and spring. The line between the sacred and the edible was thin, and beautifully blurred. You sit on a low stone bench beside a border of a lamb's lettuce, watching the bees trace their rounds. You start to realise that forgetting these plants isn't just about losing flavour, it's about losing connection, to place, to time, to ourselves. Monastic gardens were maps, Not just of what to grow, but how to live. Just beyond the cloister wall, though, lies the other half of the story, the turning point, where the quiet sanctuaries of plant wisdom were overtaken by something far louder. Monopolies, patents, trademarks. The age of the seed companies is coming. And the medieval vegetables? They didn't stand a chance. You rise from the stone bench and move toward the edge of the monastic garden, where the carefully tended beds give way to a more open, sun-baked path. The hush of the cloister fades behind you, replaced by something harder, louder, more mechanical. In the distance, you can almost hear it. A low industrial hum, the clank of machinery, the hiss of steam. You're not in the medieval world anymore. You've just crossed the threshold into the modern age. And it's not just the world that's changing, it's the seed. If the monastery was a library of living plants, then the new world rising beyond it is a factory. You can feel it in the air, sharper, colder, faster. The old ways, patient seed saving, neighbour-to-neighbour swaps, diverse crops grown with local needs in mind, are giving way to something else, something scaled, streamlined, and deeply controlled. Welcome to the era of seed monopolies. And if you're one of the 15 vegetables we've been talking about, this is the part where you start getting erased on purpose. You walk into a field now, but this one feels different from the wilder gardens behind you. The rows are perfectly aligned. The soil is flat and uniform. The plants, identical, spaced like soldiers. There's no diversity here. No random Chervil growing at the edge of a cabbage bed. No Sicily poking its frilly head out of a herb patch. This is agriculture reimagined as a spreadsheet. And at the heart of it is one cold, brutal truth. Control the seed. Control the food. It started slowly, almost invisibly. A few companies offering improved varieties in the 19th century. Nothing sinister yet. The language was all about efficiency, yield, disease resistance. Who wouldn't want that? Farmers struggling with unpredictable harvests saw hope in these new seeds. Reliable, uniform, often bred to thrive in specific climates or resist specific pests. But over time, something subtle happened. The number of available varieties began to shrink, not by accident, by design. Because here's the dirty little secret of modern agriculture. Genetically diverse crops are hard to manage at scale. Machines like uniformity, schedules like predictability, supermarkets like consistency. And the moment you start selecting for those traits, you start excluding everything else. Skirret, with its knobbly roots that grow in bunches like a fist, not welcome. Lovage, with its towering stems and aggressive scent. Too much personality. Rampion, which takes months to grow and doesn't store well. Forget it. So companies stopped offering these varieties. Seed catalogues became shorter, cleaner, safer. And then, the real shift. Seeds were no longer something you saved. They became something you bought. Every year. From them. The companies. You pause beside a neat field of hybrid lettuce. It looks fine, lush, healthy, easy on the eyes. But you can't shake the feeling that it's also empty. Like a cover band of the real thing. This lettuce hasn't been grown because it tastes great or nourishes better. It's here because it ships well, holds colour, fits into the plastic clamshells and keeps for 2 weeks without wilting. It's a logistical triumph. A culinary ghost. You can almost hear the debates crackling from boardrooms. Should we keep the heirloom sorrel that bolts in warm weather? No, it's too unpredictable. What about the Scorzonera with its weird sap and tricky roots? Market won't bite. Sea kale with its need for coastal conditions? Niche. Not scalable. Stamp it out. By the early 20th century, the seed world had transformed. Companies began patenting seeds, turning living organisms into intellectual property. What had once been shared freely among farmers and gardeners became proprietary. Contracts were introduced. Saving seed, something humans had done for thousands of years, became a legal grey area, and in many cases, flat out illegal. You pass a rusted sign half covered in weeds. Test plot. Do not enter. It's a relic, but also a warning. The land now belongs to companies. The plants too. What used to be a collaboration between nature and farmer has become a transaction, and what's not profitable doesn't make the cut. That's how we lost hundreds of varieties of vegetables, maybe thousands. They weren't failures, they just didn't fit the model. Maybe they didn't ripen at the same time. Maybe their yields were unpredictable. Maybe they were too bitter, too small, too weird looking. They were erased by absence. If you can't buy it, you can't grow it. If you can't grow it, it's gone. And here's a particularly bitter little detail. In some cases, seed companies bought up heirloom varieties just to stop other companies from offering them. Not because they planned to sell them, but because eliminating competition meant more demand for their top-performing hybrids. It was quiet, legal, and devastating. There's a scholarly argument still simmering about the ethics of all this. Some say the monopolization of seed saved the world from famine, that it streamlined production, reduced crop failure, and fed billions. Others argue it came at a staggering cost. Loss of biodiversity, loss of resilience, loss of flavour, and most hauntingly, loss of choice. Because when only a few companies own the seeds, and those seeds only grow into crops that serve profit, the eater, you, gets locked out of the decision-making. You don't choose between kale and medieval kale. You don't pick between carrots and Scorzonera. The market already chose for you. It streamlined your salad, sanitised your soup, standardised your taste. You walk to the end of the field and look back. Rows of identical lettuce, silent and clean. Nothing wrong with them exactly, but nothing remarkable either. And suddenly, you miss the messy tangle of the old garden. The overlapping scents, the crooked roots, the bite and bitterness of vegetables that came from somewhere. Real places, real soil, real people. And just ahead, through a split in the trees, another garden waits. Not old and monastic, not corporate and flattened, but wild, rebellious, untamed. These are the plants that didn't follow the rules, that insisted on their own weirdness, and they're still trying to grow. You step into the next chapter, where flavour doesn't just get ignored, it gets engineered out. You step off the rigid rows of corporate lettuce and into a field that looks, at first, like a mistake. The plants here don't match. Some are sprawling, others squat. There are purple leaves next to yellow stems, odd clusters of tiny flowers growing from unexpected places, and a smell that doesn't line up with any single scent. It's tangy, herby, maybe a little sour. This is the misfit garden, the rebel zone. And here's the kicker. Everything here once tasted like something. Not just tastes good, but taste with layers, edges, surprises. A leaf that starts sweet and ends sharp. A root that bites on the tongue before settling into warmth. A stem that's bitter in the best way. This is what food used to do, but somewhere along the way, Big Ag decided that flavour was a liability. Too complex, too inconsistent, too risky. You pick a leaf and chew, it shocks you a little. Peppery, bitter, then bright. You blink. This isn't what you're used to, and that's exactly the point. Industrial agriculture didn't just change what we grow, it changed what we expect. Because once you start optimizing vegetables for shelf life, appearance and ease of transport, flavour gets in the way. It becomes collateral damage in the pursuit of durability. Take the tomato. Originally, it came in every colour and shape, striped, lumpy, wildly fragrant and explosively flavourful. But modern breeding narrowed it down to something red, round, firm, and, let's be honest, kind of boring. The gene that makes tomatoes taste like tomatoes, that got bred out in favour of a gene that helps them ripen evenly. Translation, tomatoes look better now, but taste like damp cotton. The same thing happened to carrots, lettuce, cucumbers, even apples. Bitterness, bred out. Acidity, too unpredictable. Complexity, not worth the risk. You crouch near a patch of old-school endive, its curly leaves tinged with red. You pluck one and chew, and there it is, the bitterness. That grown-up flavour, the one that makes your mouth wake up. In medieval kitchens, bitter greens were prized. Not only did they cut through rich, fatty meals, but they were believed to stimulate digestion and balance the humours. Dandelion, sorrel, mustard greens, all full of the bitter compounds modern breeders spent decades eliminating. And why? Because bitterness doesn't focus group well. When vegetables started being mass-marketed in the mid-20th century, flavour was reframed as a sales obstacle. A carrot that tasted earthy and strong might be healthy, but if it tasted too much like the ground it came from, people hesitated. A cucumber with a sharp edge might be memorable, but supermarkets wanted neutral, consistent, inoffensive. So plants were re-engineered, selectively bred for sweetness, or for lack of anything at all. Some vegetables even had their entire chemistry altered. Take the modern bell pepper. Once pungent and slightly bitter, it's now been softened into a sugary crunch. Or broccoli, its wild cousins were stronger, more sulfuric, more intense. But the versions you see now, toned down, made palatable for a population trained on mildness, and that's not even getting into flavour volatility. Real flavour fades fast. A freshly picked leaf tastes different than one harvested, packaged, shipped, and shelved over the course of a week. So industrial crops are bred not just for blandness, but for blandness that lasts. The end result? Food that doesn't go bad quickly, but also doesn't taste alive. There's a bizarre irony here. In our quest for convenience, we've stripped our vegetables of the very thing that made them interesting. They now resist decay, resist change, resist taste. It's a bit like asking a friend to always agree with you. Comforting maybe, but also incredibly boring. You walk deeper into the patch and spot a vegetable you can't immediately identify. It's some kind of mustard maybe, or a chicory. The leaves are speckled, the veins thick, the scent peppery. You bite it, and whoa, it's intense. Not spicy like a chili, but pungent, assertive. It tells a story with every chew. It doesn't ask if you're enjoying yourself, it tells you to pay attention. That's the thing flavour does. It demands presence, and presence isn't exactly profitable, because flavour can't be standardised. You can't guarantee that every leaf of sorrel will hit the same notes, or that every bulb of Scorzonera will taste exactly the same from farm to farm. That variability, it's a nightmare for branding. So, modern agriculture sidesteps it by offering you predictability instead. You'll never be surprised by a baby spinach leaf, because that spinach was never meant to surprise you. There's a fringe movement of breeders and chefs now pushing back. People digging through seed banks, hunting down pre-industrial cultivars, trying to bring back the lost flavours of plants that were never meant to be tamed. They speak about rescuing bitterness, reintroducing funk, and flavour density. They're not looking for neatness. They're looking for memory, for the taste of food that was once as messy and complex as the people who ate it. You pass a bed of forgotten greens, some bolting, some wilting, some sprouting new shoots. Nothing uniform, nothing clean. And yet there's a kind of beauty in it. A reminder that vegetables, like stories, aren't meant to be flattened. They're meant to be grown, chewed, and remembered. You reach down and pull up a root that looks like it hasn't been seen in 100 years. It's crooked, gnarly, dirt clung. You wipe it off, snap a piece, and bite. It's bitter. A little sweet. Funky. You have no idea what it is, and that's thrilling. Just beyond the edge of this field, you spot a shadow falling across the land. Tall silos, endless rows, and trucks loaded with boxes. That's where flavour went to die. But before we get there, you need to understand what else got sacrificed along the way. Texture, shelf life, resilience, and how every time we demanded a longer-lasting lettuce, we lost something soulful in return. You walk forward, still chewing, the taste lingering. Real, strange, unforgettable. Flavour that refuses to be forgotten. The wind shifts again, and this time it carries with it something far less romantic. A dry, sterile smell, like cardboard and bleach and faint exhaust. You're walking into the distribution zone now. No more wandering beds of forgotten vegetables, no more crumbling monastery walls or sun-warmed kitchen plots. This is the part of the story where food becomes product. And vegetables? They're about to get boxed, barcoded and bartered. Welcome to the kingdom of shelf life. It starts with a cold, gleaming warehouse. You can almost see it in your mind. A vast room filled with uniform crates of produce, chilled to within a degree of frost. Everything stacked high in towering rows under fluorescent lights. Lettuce, carrots, tomatoes. But not just any versions. These are the chosen ones. The ones bred not for boldness or nutrition or flavour, but for their ability to sit in that warehouse for days, even weeks, without collapsing. The supermodels of the vegetable world. All looks, no depth. You reach into a box and pick up a tomato. It's firm, unblemished, perfectly red. A machine could have picked it, and probably did. But when you bite in, the illusion shatters. It's mealy, damp. It tastes like nothing. Like someone once described a tomato to an algorithm, and the algorithm made its best guess. This is what happens when shelf life becomes the primary design spec. For produce to make it through harvesting, transport, warehousing, display, and finally into a shopper's basket, it can't be fragile. It can't bruise. It can't soften too soon. It has to be patient, like a vegetable version of a durable good. So flavour, water content, delicate skin, and natural variation all get sacrificed on the altar of longevity. You move to another crate, this one filled with celery. Crisp? Sure. But the flavour? Mild to the point of invisibility. A few feet away there's a stack of iceberg lettuce. Pale, crunchy, and about as complex as a glass of ice water. These vegetables are built to last, not to live. And that's a big difference. In medieval times, perishability wasn't a flaw. It was a sign of freshness, a reminder that food came from living systems, and that eating was part of that fleeting rhythm. You harvested when it was ripe. You cooked quickly. You used what you had. Now, the produce has to wait, on trucks, in stores, in your fridge. It has to be durable, like luggage. This obsession with shelf life didn't come out of nowhere. It grew out of a global food system that's perpetually trying to minimize waste, reduce costs, and standardize offerings. And on paper, that's not a bad thing. Nobody wants to throw out soggy greens or mouldy peppers. But the trade-offs are enormous. You think back to the Scorzonera root. Delicious, but sticky and awkward to clean. Or sea kale, with its short harvest window and delicate stems. These never had a chance. You can't ship them across the country and expect them to look good 3 days later. You can't bag them in plastic and promise a 10-day shelf life. So they were left behind. Not because they weren't good, but because they weren't convenient. There's a leafy green here. Standard supermarket spinach. You bite into a leaf. It crunches faintly, tastes vaguely green, and then nothing. A few hundred years ago, a kitchen garden would have had dozens of varieties of spinach-like greens, some spicy, some sharp, some dense and chewy, others light and frilly. But those were bred out in favour of the one that held up best in bags. You pause beside a cold crate filled with carrots, and for a second it feels like déjà vu. They're all the same length, same colour, same width, identical, almost unnaturally so. You remember that carrots weren't always orange. They came in purple, yellow, white, often sweeter, sometimes earthier. But the Dutch bred orange carrots to honour the House of Orange, and the rest is literal history. The orange stuck, everything else faded, and then, when shipping and storage became priority, carrots were bred to be tougher, longer lasting, less prone to splitting, not tastier, just safer to sell. This is the logic of shelf life. It asks one question, and one question only. How long can this sit before it goes bad? Not, how good is it when it's fresh? Not, how much does it nourish or delight? And certainly not, what's the story behind this plant? Just how long can it last? It's a dull question, and unfortunately it's become the loudest voice in the room. There's a fringe argument among food activists that shelf life isn't just a convenience metric. It's a cultural filter, a form of taste washing. It edits out anything regional, seasonal or fragile. It homogenizes the plate. It says, all lettuce must be crisp, all tomatoes must be round, all cucumbers must survive a week in the back of a fridge. It's like a gatekeeping system for vegetables. If you can't pass the test, you don't get in. And here's the most tragic part. Most consumers don't even realise what they're missing. They think they've tasted kale. They haven't. They think they know what a tomato is. They don't. Because the versions available to them have been drained of character in the name of convenience. The loss is silent, but it's everywhere. In every lifeless salad, every disappointing vegetable soup, every side of steamed broccoli that tastes like green air. You reach the end of the warehouse and look back. Everything in here is clean, controlled, safe. But it also feels haunted, like a museum exhibit of vegetables that once had ancestors with real flavour, real risk, real soul. You can almost hear the whispers of Skirret, of sea kale, of Sicily. They wouldn't have survived here. They would have bruised, wilted, rebelled. And maybe that's the real lesson. Shelf life didn't just change vegetables, it changed us. It taught us to prioritise endurance over enjoyment, predictability over pleasure. But outside, just beyond the delivery docks and barcoded bins, the wind still blows through wild plants. And some people, quietly, stubbornly, are going back to them. You head toward the exit, passing a chart titled Days to Expiry. You shake your head. Some flavours don't expire, they just get buried. And now, as you return to the open fields, you're about to see how colonialism played its hand in that burial, shuffling crops, rewriting tastes, and helping erase a whole continent's edible past. You leave the sterile chill of the warehouse behind, stepping back into sunlight that feels warmer now, more personal, more forgiving. But the air carries a different weight here. It's not the same gentle hum of monastic gardens or the earthy chaos of medieval vegetable patches. This place feels older and heavier, even though it's full of new crops. You're standing at the edge of a global crossroads. Colonial trade routes, conquest and cuisine all collide here. And the story they tell isn't just about food, it's about power. You've arrived at the Great Vegetable Shuffle, where entire agricultural systems were uprooted, relocated and rewritten. The ground beneath your feet isn't neutral, it's shaped by centuries of forced migration, plunder and plantation agriculture. And with that came a fundamental shift in what people grew, ate and forgot. Some vegetables were pushed to the margins, not because they were inferior, but because they were in the way of empire, in the way of markets, in the way of monoculture. You glance down and see a small patch of native European greens, things like Rampion, Alexanders, and Good King Henry, growing almost like ghosts in the cracks. Around them tower rows of New World crops, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, beans. And on the other side you see tropical plants that were once confined to narrow regions. Chili peppers, cassava, sweet potatoes, okra, now global citizens. The Columbian Exchange, they called it. But exchange is a polite word. What it really was in many places was replacement. You kneel beside a patch of maize and think about what it dislodged. Before corn swept through Europe, medieval grain systems revolved around rye, barley and millet. Local, adapted, regionally specific. But maize was high yield, calorie dense, and easier to grow in certain climates. Suddenly, entire communities pivoted. It was a crop that colonists could export and control, unlike the messier, more varied grain systems that came before. The same thing happened with potatoes, efficient, filling, dependable. But their rise edged out roots like Skirret, Scorzonera, and even Burdock. Not because they were better, just more scalable. But the impact wasn't just in Europe. In Africa, traditional grains like sorghum and millet were pushed aside by rice and corn. In South America, native tubers were replaced by introduced crops meant to serve export economies. Colonial agriculture didn't just bring new vegetables, it often suppressed or eliminated indigenous ones. Plants with centuries of cultural and ecological relevance were deemed unprofitable or unsophisticated and discarded in favour of crops that could fit into plantation systems. And here's the cruel irony. Some of the very vegetables that were erased in Europe by colonial crops were also erased in the colonies. Lovage, once grown in European gardens and monasteries, didn't travel with colonists. Neither did Sicily, Scorzonera or Skirret. Colonial powers weren't interested in preserving vegetable biodiversity. They were interested in calories, profits, and control. So instead of spreading the variety, they streamlined it. You imagine a British settler in the 1700s, building a homestead in the Americas. He's not growing medieval kale or chervil. He's planting wheat and barley, maybe some cabbage. But mostly he's interested in tobacco and sugar, cash crops, the kinds that filled ships, not soup bowls. And the culinary traditions of both colonizer and colonized began to narrow, bend, and eventually snap under the pressure of global commerce. Meanwhile, back in Europe, as exotic imports flooded in, old plants started to feel old. Rampion, too rustic. Sea kale, too weird. Good King. Henry, too peasant. These plants were tied to a pre-colonial identity, a food culture shaped by small plots and seasonal cycles. But now people were eating tomatoes, drinking cocoa, spicing their stews with chili, and there's nothing wrong with those things except that they didn't expand the palate, they replaced it. There's a quiet scholarly debate here. Some historians argue that the Columbian exchange enriched global diets, introducing variety where there was once monotony. Others argue that it homogenized flavour, reducing the world's edible diversity by replacing hundreds of regional crops with a few mega crops: corn, wheat, sugar, rice, potatoes. And even now, most of the calories humans consume come from just a handful of these staples. You look back at the medieval vegetables now dwarfed by newer imports. It's not jealousy you feel, it's grief. Because these weren't just ingredients. They were the edible memory of a place, a people, a time before cuisine became commerce. And while the new crops are valuable, their arrival marked the beginning of something else. A system that didn't just feed people, it fed markets. Walk a little further and you see the remnants of colonial seed catalogues, weathered pages filled with ink drawings of exotic plants, often paired with descriptions like improved, superior, or modern. In those same pages, the old European vegetables are either absent or framed as inferior, primitive, or unworthy of cultivation. The narrative wasn't subtle. It said, out with the old, in with the global. You crouch beside a row of tomatoes, beautiful, red, photogenic. These weren't in Europe before the 16th century, and yet now they define entire cuisines. That's the strange duality of food history. It's constantly evolving, but always at a cost. Every new ingredient comes with something left behind, and in the case of colonialism, what was left behind wasn't just flavour, it was autonomy, tradition, memory. And here's a final twist. Some of the vegetables that were suppressed in Europe also faced suppression in the colonies for different reasons. Not because they weren't profitable, but because they were too closely tied to indigenous knowledge. Colonisers often viewed native crops as backward. They forced local farmers to abandon traditional plants in favour of European ones, even when the native ones were better suited to the land. The erasia was both culinary and cultural. You rise and scan the garden again. It's not a neat story. There's no simple villain. Some crops flourished, others vanished, and some were caught in between, traded across oceans and transformed into shadows of themselves. But now, you start to see the pattern more clearly. Every act of domination, political, economic, agricultural, left a mark on what ended up on the plate. Just beyond the final row of maize, you see another space, overgrown, slightly chaotic, but with a distinctly different energy. This is where the witch trials echo, where women's knowledge of plants, vegetables, herbs and healing roots was taken, criminalised, or burned. The story's about to get darker. You step through the last of the colonial crops, their tidy rows tapering off like the final lines of a ledger, and into a place where the air shifts again, this time darker, quieter, charged. The trees here grow closer together. The light filters through in thin, dappled strands. There's something older in this space, something whispered rather than spoken. You've arrived in the place where food knowledge stopped being just forgotten and started being punished. This is the garden of the accused, of the outcast, of the so-called witches. It's not a real garden, of course, not anymore, but it was once, or many were, scattered across medieval and early modern Europe. Small kitchen plots tended by women who knew what to plant and when, what root eased childbirth, what herb dulled pain, what leafy green flushed out a fever. These weren't witches in pointed hats. They were midwives, healers, cooks, and caretakers, and they knew their vegetables. You walk past clumps of plants that once lived in those gardens: mugwort, fennel, wormwood, sorrel, wild garlic, Alexanders. Their uses weren't just culinary. They were medicinal, ritualistic, and deeply tied to the rhythm of female life. Menstruation, childbirth, menopause, fertility. Topics that were not openly discussed in church sermons or university lectures, but women talked about them, in gardens, at hearths, and in whispers. And here's the twist. Many of the vegetables and herbs we now view as quaint or harmless were once evidence in witch trials. Growing too many medicinal plants? Suspicious. Knowing how to make a poultice for bruises or a tea for sleeplessness? dangerous. Offering neighbours a tonic for colic, might want to check for devil's marks. Because for centuries women's botanical knowledge was seen not as wisdom, but as threat, especially when that knowledge lived outside the control of doctors, priests and state-sanctioned agriculture. These weren't just gardens, they were sites of power, and in a patriarchal system, unsanctioned power is always a problem. You kneel beside a thicket of rue, strong-smelling evergreen once used in stews and medicinal brews. It was believed to protect against evil, but also associated with witches. In some regions, simply having rue growing in your yard was enough to raise suspicion. Lovage, with its intense scent and medicinal strength, was another suspect. Even garden cress, a humble little leaf, was tied to female sexuality and reproductive health. The plants weren't inherently dangerous, but the knowledge of how to use them was. And here's the thing, no one says out loud. Some of these so-called witches were simply women who refused to forget what they knew. They held on to the old recipes, the bitter greens that brought back appetite after illness, the roots that soothed cramping bellies, the leaves that could cause a pregnancy to end if taken in a certain dose. These weren't spells, they were survival strategies, botanical fluency in an age without painkillers, doctors or prenatal care. But survival knowledge, in the wrong social context, turns political fast. And when paranoia about witches reached its peak, especially in the 15th through 17th centuries, plants became weapons of accusation. A woman caught drying herbs might be accused of brewing poisons, a collection of seeds in a pouch, evidence of spells, a garden too lush, too productive, too organised. Witchcraft, clearly. The irony, of course, is that many of these plants were also listed in formal herbals, including those written by male scholars. But when women knew them, really knew them, they became dangerous. That knowledge was personal, unregulated, and often passed down through generations of mothers, daughters, grandmothers, a lineage that didn't need books, just hands in soil and attention to detail. You stand in front of a Scorzonera plant, its black root stretching deep into the ground, leaves splayed wide like green spokes. You imagine a woman harvesting it in the early morning, using it to make a broth for her feverish child. Nothing magical, just practical. But if the child died, and if neighbours were fearful, that same root might be used as evidence against her. After all, what kind of woman knows the names of plants the church never mentions? There's a quiet, scholarly debate now about how much actual plant knowledge was lost in the witch hunts. Some say it wasn't as extensive as people claim, that these women were rarely executed just for their gardening. Others argue that we're underestimating the impact of fear. When people are burned for what they know, others stop teaching, they stop sharing. The knowledge goes underground, or disappears entirely. You reach a cluster of mallow plants, used for wounds, for soothing digestion, for quieting irritated lungs. It was once everywhere. But like so many of the vegetables in this story, it's not in your grocery store anymore. Why? Because it was tied to a time when people used what they had. When knowledge came from the garden, not the pharmacy. And when a woman's cure might be called a crime. The modern world did its best to clean all this up. It took the plants, stripped away the folklore, separated the medicine from the myth, and turned them into supplements. Mallow extract, Lovage capsules, dandelion tea in shiny boxes. But something is missing in those versions. The connection, the dirt, the history. You glance around the shadowed garden again, its wildness still pulsing. You start to understand why some vegetables were lost. Not because they didn't grow well, or taste good, or nourish the body, but because the people who kept them alive were silenced. And without gardeners, even the strongest plants fade. You walk toward the edge of the trees where the sunlight breaks through again. In the distance, a market rises. Not medieval, not modern, but something in between. The age of heirlooms, of revival, of people digging back into the past and trying to unearth what was buried. The witch trials ended, the knowledge didn't. It just went quiet. And now, finally it's speaking again. The trees open up ahead, and the hush of the witch's garden gives way to a different kind of buzz. Not ominous, not industrial, but lively. You step into the edge of a market. Not the kind with glossy branding and uniform produce stacked like military formations, but something more intimate. handmade signs, crates filled with uneven colours, baskets woven from real reeds instead of plastic. Welcome to the Heirloom Revival, the part of the story where lost vegetables start clawing their way back into the light. The air here is thick with smells. Earth, spices, something roasting over coals nearby. You spot stalls piled high with vegetables you actually recognise from earlier in your journey, just not in the way you're used to. Skirret, still knobby and awkward, its pale roots tangled like string. A bundle of lovage so strong it's perfuming the entire row. There's burdock, sea kale, even a few unassuming bundles of Scorzonera wrapped in damp cloth to keep the roots from drying out. This is the farmer's market as rebellion, a kind of open-air resistance against the supermarket monoculture, a reminder that there was never one way to eat, never one kind of carrot, never one flavour to represent a vegetable. You walk through the stalls like you're browsing a museum of things that were almost lost. And yet here they are, living, edible history, sold by people who remembered what mattered. You stop at a stall where a woman is chopping samples of Rampion root. She offers you a slice. It's earthy, a little sweet, faintly nutty. Most people think this is wild lettuce, she says, smiling. They don't realise it used to be in every garden a few hundred years ago. She laughs like she's in on a secret the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. You ask her where she got the seeds. She tells you, a friend of a friend, who got them from a seed-saving collective, who found them through an old German seed catalogue from the 1700s. Nothing quick, nothing easy, but completely worth it. Because that's what heirloom vegetables demand, patience. You don't just plant them and wait. You search for them, trade for them, nurture them, and then hope they don't disappear again. The term heirloom gets thrown around a lot these days, used in marketing to sell everything from tomatoes to toilet paper, but it actually means something. In the plant world, an heirloom is a cultivar that has been passed down, usually for at least 50 years, often through families or communities. These aren't products, they're relationships. Each seed comes with a story. A grandmother's, garden, a wartime meal, a forgotten corner of a monastery. Heirlooms don't just grow, they remember. You crouch beside a crate of sea kale, and the seller tells you that his grandfather used to forage it along the English coast during the Depression. No one grows it anymore, he says. Too salty, too stubborn. But it's one of the few things that kept the family fed. You nod, thinking about how many of these vegetables only survived because someone, somewhere, refused to let them go. Someone said, "This root matters. This leaf has value. This plant deserves space." That's the thing about heirlooms. They aren't profitable in the industrial sense. They don't ship well. They don't always germinate reliably. Their flavours can be intense, unpredictable, even challenging. They don't conform. But that's also why they're beloved by those who grow them. You have to meet these plants on their own terms, and in return they give you something supermarket vegetables never can. Complexity, depth, a kind of stubborn beauty. You bite into a slice of raw Chervil root, sweet, fragrant, like a cross between parsley and anise. A flavour that lingers. You start to see that what was once considered forgotten is simply waiting for attention. And people are paying attention again. Home gardeners, chefs, foragers, seed savers, permaculturists and off-grid dreamers, all of them are part of the quiet heirloom revolution. It's not flashy. It doesn't come with a jingle, but it's happening. There's a booth here run by a small urban seed collective. They're selling packets of medieval vegetable seeds in hand-stamped envelopes. Skirret, Good King Henry, Mallow, even Alexanders. The sign above the booth reads, "Grow the future by planting the past." It sounds cheesy, but you believe them. Every seed in those envelopes is an act of defiance against the flattening of food culture. And here's a quirky fact you might not expect. Some heirloom vegetables owe their survival to sheer weirdness. Take the purple carrots. For centuries, orange was the only game in town, standardised, expected. But a handful of growers kept planting the freaks, the purples, the reds, the nearly black roots. They didn't sell well, but they looked cool. Then Instagram happened. Suddenly weird vegetables were trendy. And just like that, plants once mocked as ugly or inferior became objects of fascination. It's ridiculous, but also kind of perfect. A social media app accidentally revived a 1,000-year-old carrot variety. Welcome to the future. There's a mild debate in heirloom circles. Should we stick to historical purity, or should we allow for playful crossbreeding and experimentation? Some seed savers are strict, insisting that the only real heirlooms are the ones passed down untouched. Others argue that adaptation is the whole point. A skirret grown in Wisconsin might evolve different traits than one grown in southern France, and that's not a flaw. That's how we get resilience. You take one last loop around the market. The vegetables here aren't just food. They're proof that memory can grow back, that erasure isn't permanent, that what was once pulled up by the roots can return, if someone cares enough to dig. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the uneven crates and tarps. You step away, pockets full of seed packets, the flavour of Rampion still on your tongue. And just as you're leaving, you spot one last booth with a sign that reads, "Pre-industrial greens, grown with post-apocalyptic hope." You chuckle, but also, yeah, that's the vibe. Just ahead, there's another path. This one leads into the lab, because as much as heirloom vegetables are about the past, there's also a future, full of gene editing, seed banks, climate-proof hybrids, and a new question. What happens when we try to design the perfect vegetable? You step off the dusty market path and into a landscape that looks like something out of a sci-fi dream. Clean lines, mirrored windows, controlled air. The garden here is gone, replaced with polished steel benches, LED grow lights, and long rows of nutrient trays humming quietly under artificial sun. Welcome to the laboratory. You're not in the world of forgotten vegetables anymore. You're in the future, the part where scientists don't just grow food, they design it. It's eerily quiet. No buzzing bees, no chirping birds, no wind through the leaves. Just the soft hum of electricity and the occasional blip of a monitoring screen. Each plant is contained, labelled, documented. They don't grow from seeds pushed into dirt anymore. Here, they emerge from petri dishes and precision genetics. You're staring down the polished face of food's next evolution. But it raises a question you didn't expect to ask. After centuries of losing vegetables to market forces, colonization and suppression, are we now trying to build them back from scratch? Can you actually engineer your way back to the richness of the medieval garden? Or is this something else entirely? You lean in over one glowing tray and see a tiny, perfect lettuce leaf, no bigger than your palm. It's been gene-edited to resist heat, bolt slowly, and develop a slightly higher vitamin content. It looks flawless. But does it taste like anything? You're told it does. Neutral, with hints of butter, which sounds more like a dating profile than a vegetable. Another tray holds a row of microscaled turnips, hybridized from Japanese heirlooms and medieval European cultivars, genetically trimmed for uniformity. The technician beside you explains that they were designed to grow in stacked vertical farms inside shipping containers. Perfect for urban food deserts, he says. And he's not wrong. But you're starting to realise that perfection here doesn't mean flavour. It means predictability. This is the post-heirloom future. The logic is different now. We're not saving plants because they have history. We're building plants to solve problems. And in a world facing climate chaos, water scarcity and population growth, that makes sense. But it also creates a new kind of tension. When you build a vegetable in a lab, you gain control. But what do you lose? You walk past a climate-controlled room where sea kale is being optimised. The technician explains that they're working on a version that doesn't require coastal salt exposure. "It'll be sea kale without the sea," he says proudly. You nod, but inside something itches. Is it still sea kale if it doesn't taste like the coast anymore? That's the crux of the debate humming beneath this entire facility. Should we revive old vegetables as they were, flaws and all? Or should we improve them for modern needs? Some scientists argue that gene editing allows us to reintroduce lost traits, flavour, nutrition, even colour, without the baggage of poor yield or fragility. Others argue that the very idea of improvement is rooted in the same mindset that erased those vegetables in the first place, the belief that nature must conform. You glance at a touchscreen display showing the genome of an ancient carrot cultivar. They've isolated the pigment pathways that create its deep purple skin and paired them with genes from a modern disease-resistant orange variety. It's sleek, elegant, and kind of impressive. But it also feels like someone remixing an ancient folk song with synthesizers. Sure, it sounds cool, but is it the same song? A fringe fact floats up in your memory. CRISPR, the gene editing tool now central to all this, was first discovered in bacteria, and the very vegetables being tweaked with it now, some of them were the same ones once used in ancient herbal medicine to fight those same bacteria. It's like the plants are being edited by the descendants of the things they once helped us resist. Welcome to full circle weirdness. And here's something even stranger. Some scientists are trying to de-extinct vegetables. No, really. They're working with fragments of old seeds, some found in Arctic seed banks, others excavated from medieval latrine pits. Yes, gross but true. Trying to bring back cultivars we thought were gone forever. If that sounds like vegetable necromancy, that's because it kind of is. You pass another glowing chamber and see a tray-marked Cucurbita alpina, alpine sow thistle, once eaten in parts of medieval Italy and France, now rare and wild. They're testing it for domestication potential. It has a reputation for being bitter, but high in antioxidants. They're trying to reduce the bitterness without losing the nutrients. Flavour correction, they call it. Which sounds disturbingly like censorship, but for plants. There's another line of argument that pops up here. Should we even want to eat exactly like people in the Middle Ages? After all, they didn't have refrigerators or sanitation, or a solid understanding of nutrition. Isn't it better to use modern science to give us the best of both worlds? The forgotten vegetables, redesigned for today? Maybe. Maybe not. You remember what the heirloom growers said? These plants aren't just flavours, they're stories. When you erase the bitter edge from a leaf, or shorten the shape of a root to make it fit in a container farm, you might be making it easier to sell. But are you also muting the story? You crouch beside a hydroponic trough growing medieval chard. The technician explains that it's been gene-edited to reduce its oxalate content. Fine, maybe even helpful. But it also means it won't have that metallic tang anymore, the one that makes your tongue tingle and your teeth squeak. That's the taste of the past. Gone. There's a part of you that marvels at all this. It's undeniably brilliant. A plant that once took 90 days to grow now takes 30. Another resists 6 kinds of mildew. A third produces twice the leaf mass with half the water. Science is saving plants, but also rewriting them. You just wonder if, in saving them, we're also making them forget who they were. You move to the far corner of the lab where an entire wall is lined with refrigerators. Inside are seeds, thousands of them, labelled, categorised, frozen in time. Some will never be grown again. Others will become the parents of something entirely new. This is the new monastery, the new vault. Except instead of monks we have lab coats, and instead of handwritten herbals we have genome spreadsheets. As you leave the lab, you look over your shoulder one last time. There's a light still glowing behind a pane of glass. Inside, a single sprout rises from a tray. It's labelled Skirret V2.3. You can't help but hope it still tastes like it used to. Sweet, awkward, knobby, and alive. Outside, the air is cool again. You hear birds, feel dirt under your shoes. There's one last garden to visit. Not in the past or the future, but in the cracks of the present. The community plots, the rebel yards, the seed swaps in church basements, because that's where the last battle is being fought, for memory, for flavour, for freedom from the barcode. You step back into open air, blinking against the sunlight after the chill glow of the lab. Your shoes crunch on gravel again, not polished floors. The silence of controlled conditions is replaced by something messier, warmer. Laughter, distant voices, the faint clang of tools and the rhythmic squeak of a garden gate. You're in the middle of a community garden now, fenced off from a city street but alive with colour and noise. And this, surprisingly, is where some of the most exciting vegetable resurrection is happening. No one's wearing a lab coat, no one's measuring light spectra or optimizing nutrient cycles. Instead, there are plastic watering cans, bent wire fences, a half-broken wheelbarrow filled with compost. The air smells like tomato leaves, mint and sweat. This isn't corporate, institutional or curated. It's entirely human, and it might just be the best hope these lost vegetables have left. You walk between the beds, and the diversity is immediate. One patch holds lumpy, violet-skinned carrots. An old French landrace someone's grandmother mailed from Lyon. Another brims with something that looks like kale but isn't. It's medieval kale, sprawling, towering, bitter, and magnificent. There's even a square of Rampion, almost hidden under marigolds, and a few plants of good King Henry cheerfully bolting in the corner. No two plots are the same. This is the opposite of monoculture. It's chaos with intention, gardens shaped by personal taste, childhood memory, accident, and sheer curiosity. And in that chaos, vegetables are surviving. Not because anyone told people to grow them, but because someone chose to. That's the quiet rebellion. Not against science, not even against Big Ag, really. Just against forgetting. You sit beside a young gardener hunched over a notebook, scribbling seed notes, when she planted, how it sprouted, what the leaves tasted like raw versus cooked. She offers you a bite of something she calls not lettuce, which turns out to be lamb's lettuce. Mild, nutty, like a green that actually means it. Found the seeds on a seed swap forum, she says. No one had grown it here in years. Around the corner, a retired teacher shows you his Scorzonera bed. He explains, at length, how he's been trying to keep it going since the 1980s, when he first read about it in an old Italian cookbook. Tastes like oysters if you roast it right, he insists. You nod politely, then bite into a slice he hands you. It's earthy, strange, and... actually, yeah. Maybe he's onto something. You're struck by how little money's involved here. No one's selling anything. They're trading, sharing, experimenting. One woman has a stash of sea kale seeds she's hoarding for spring, but she'll gladly give you a few if you promise to save some from your crop and pass them on. There are no contracts, no barcodes, just trust. And here's where the weird truth settles in. This is the opposite of everything that sidelined the medieval vegetables in the first place. No standardization, no industrial optimization, no market readiness. Just people, seeds, soil, and memory. It's agriculture by the people, for the people, and rooted in the belief that food shouldn't be boring or centralized. You pick up a leaflet from a bench. It's from a seed sovereignty group advocating for open source seeds. You wouldn't download one song and call it music, it reads. So why are we planting one type of cabbage and calling it food? That hits, because the more you think about it, the more the modern vegetable aisle feels like an over-filtered playlist. Predictable, sanitized, and deeply forgettable. These community gardens aren't just about nostalgia, though. They're also laboratories, less clinical, more communal. Growers here are testing how forgotten vegetables do in different soils, under climate stress, with less water. A guy in a bucket hat points out his chervil, proudly explaining how it's doing better in partial shade. Another woman's experimenting with skirret interplanted between her beans and onions. Keeps the soil looser, she says, and I think it sweetens the beans a little. It's not just experimentation, it's adaptation. This is evolution in real time. The plants respond to local climates, the growers save seeds from the best performers, and slowly, generation by generation, those vegetables become local again, not global, not universal. Just deeply rooted in one place, the way they used to be. And it's not just the growing that matters, it's the eating. Someone waves you over to a picnic table where people are sharing dishes. Skirret mash with garlic and sage, a salad of lamb's lettuce and mallow, grilled sea kale stalks with lemon and oil. It's not Instagram food. It's earthy, vibrant, and deeply flavourful, the kind of food that makes you close your eyes while chewing. You overhear a story about a local school adding a medieval vegetable patch to their garden programme. Kids are growing Rampion and Burdock. They're learning that vegetables don't have to be boring, and that the past isn't just something you read about. It's something you can taste, and that's where the hope kicks in. Because this isn't just a curiosity project. It's a movement. Quiet, grassroots, but growing. Seed libraries in public buildings, online heirloom trading forums, guerrilla gardeners planting Scorzonera in abandoned lots. The medieval vegetables aren't just making a comeback, they're making a point. They're reminding us that food was once wild, diverse and intimate, that we weren't meant to eat the same 5 vegetables forever. That bitterness, funkiness, crookedness, these aren't defects, they're personality, they're flavour, they're survival. And while Big Ag might still control most of the world's food systems, this little garden plot, This pocket of resistance. It doesn't care about patents. It doesn't care about yield per acre. It cares about the joy of pulling something strange and beautiful out of the dirt and saying, "I remember you." You get up, brushing soil off your hands, and look around one last time. Someone's trimming Alexanders near the fence. Someone else is stuffing a bag with kale that looks like it belongs in a medieval banquet. In this quiet space, the vegetables never really left. They were just waiting for someone to notice. Ahead is your final stop, a meal, a table, a way to bring everything full circle. You're going to eat like it's $13.99, and no barcode is invited. The last light of the day slants low across the path as you leave the garden, your hands still, smelling faintly of soil and fennel. The air is quieter here, more focused. Up ahead, there's a long wooden table under a vine-covered pergola, rustic and inviting, the kind of place that looks like it's waiting for a meal to change your life. This is it. Your edible time machine. The final scene. You're about to sit down and eat like it's $13.99. No electric lights, no metal forks, no balsamic drizzle. Just earthenware bowls, wooden spoons, linen napkins worn soft with age. The scent drifting from the hearth is rich and unfamiliar. Peppery, earthy, green with something vaguely medicinal curling through it. It smells ancient, like a forest cooking. You're handed a small cup of ale, not sweet, not hoppy, but sharp and faintly sour, brewed with herbs instead of hops. Beside it, a trench of bread, not a plate, but a thick slab of sour rye designed to soak up whatever comes next. It's dense, cracked, honest. Already you can tell this isn't food made to please. It's food made to sustain, and somewhere in there, to surprise. The first course arrives in a shallow bowl, a thick stew of skirret and leeks, flecked with chervil and a hint of mallow. You dig in, and instantly it hits you. This is not modern stew, it's sweet, yes, but also sharp and woodsy. The skirret tastes like parsnip's eccentric cousin, soft with a floral note you can't quite place. The broth is thin but potent, seasoned with vinegar, herbs, and something wild. A medieval kitchen's idea of comfort food. Healing, hearty, oddly haunting. Next comes a platter of greens. Not just lettuce, but a riot of forgotten leaves. Good King Henry, Alexanders, lamb's lettuce, and dandelion tossed with mustard oil and wild garlic. The bitterness grabs you first. Assertive, unapologetic. It feels like biting into history, like someone reminding you that food used to bite back. But it's not unpleasant, it's balanced. Every leaf does something different on your tongue. Prickly, smooth, numbing, zesty. It's like salad, but with an attitude. Then a roasted root medley appears. Burdock, Scorzonera, parsnip, and what you think might be Rampion root. It's caramelised and crispy around the edges, soft in the middle, with a drizzle of honey and vinegar. You get why medieval cooks obsessed over roots. They were the hidden treasure, plain on the outside, wild on the inside. The Scorzonera is especially weird and wonderful, almost like an artichoke crossed with dark chocolate. Who knew? As the dishes keep coming, so do the stories. One by one, each vegetable whispers where it came from. Lovage tells you about forgotten soups, thick and herbal. Sea kale arrives grilled, charred like asparagus but juicier, with that salty tang of something snatched from the edge of the sea. Mallow appears again in a tart, green and creamy inside a rye crust, both soothing and sharp. You begin to realise that this meal isn't just reviving lost plants, it's reviving a lost language of flavour. One with bitterness, sourness, pungency, even funkiness. All the things modern food smoothed out. Across the table, someone is slicing medieval kale into a thick stew, bubbling with broad beans and garlic mustard. It's chewy, rustic and unrefined, in the best way. This isn't kale that shows up in a smoothie or a spa menu. This kale feels like it could wrestle you and win. You respect it. Then comes a sweet, if you can call it that. A custard of chervil root and honey, faintly herbal and grassy. No sugar bombs here. Just the soft, complex sweetness of a world that didn't have refined sugar to lean on. Dessert used to be subtler. You had to pay attention. The open scholarly debate here, the one that people nibble at over glasses of mead, is whether this kind of eating is even good by modern standards. Some food historians say it's too coarse, too bitter, too labour-intensive. Others argue that's the point, that it forces you to reckon with taste in a deeper way. You're not just feeding yourself, you're participating in something, a memory, a survival, a legacy. Someone reads aloud from an old herbal, describing how Alexanders were once used to treat sore throats and served as a spring tonic. Someone else explains how burdock seeds were taken to Japan and transformed into gobo. You start to see the threads. The vegetables didn't vanish completely. They just changed shape, moved underground, hid in cuisine, in medicine, in myth. There's a final dish, a soup made with fermented sorrel and lovage, dark and almost brothy, served in a clay mug. It's sour and sharp like vegetable umami. You sip it slowly, feeling every inch of its journey. This isn't the taste of the past trying to come back. This is the past, still here, still alive, because someone kept stirring the pot. You lean back in your chair as the light fades. The table is messy now, crumbs, stained bowls, a few wayward leaves of something pungent and green. But it's also beautiful. You've just eaten a piece of history. Not recreated, not reimagined, just restored. And now, you get it. These vegetables didn't get banned by law. They got erased by systems that preferred neatness, compliance, and scale. But they're still here, beneath the weeds, in forgotten gardens, tucked into seed packets mailed across borders with scribbled notes and smudged ink. They're waiting in the dirt, for someone curious, for someone brave, for someone like you. Because once you taste them, really taste them, you start asking questions. You start looking at your grocery store differently. You start wondering what else has been edited out of your plate, and your story. And maybe, just maybe, you start growing your own. The candles flicker, the meal is over, but the memory will linger. Every time you bite into a bitter green, or smell a strange root, or dig your fingers into cold soil looking for something different, you'll remember this table, this night, this world you stepped into where vegetables weren't just food. They were resistance. The night deepens now. The last dishes have been cleared, the final candle gutted out, and the table sits quiet beneath the stars. You lean back, full, but not just with food. You're full of something older, slower, something wilder than what you're used to. You came here chasing a headline, 15 medieval vegetables big agriculture banned. But what you found was something harder to pin down. A tapestry unravelled, a flavour reawakened, a truth that lived in the dirt, quietly stubborn. You walked through gardens that no longer exist and stood in kitchens that have long gone cold. You bit into vegetables that once fed monks, peasants, witches and queens. You saw how food isn't just fuel, it's memory, it's rebellion, and it's personal. Not everything we lost was an accident. Some plants disappeared because they were hard to grow or too fragile to ship. But many were erased on purpose because they didn't fit the model. They were too bitter, too knobby, too weird, or simply grew in the wrong hands. Women, healers, migrants, colonized peoples. And when you realize that, you start to taste everything differently. But here's the good news. Seeds remember. Even after decades, centuries, buried in forgotten cellars or packed away in freezer vaults, they remember how to grow, how to stretch toward the sun, how to pull something sacred from the soil. All it takes is someone willing to plant them, someone willing to care, someone willing to bite into a root and say, yes, this matters. So maybe you'll never find Scorzonera in your grocery store, or Skirret, or Sicily, or Good King Henry, but maybe you'll grow them, or find them at a scrappy farmer's market, or recognise them in a story told by someone's grandmother who still remembers how they tasted. Because this isn't just about vegetables, it's about what happens when we stop accepting blandness, when we choose flavour over convenience, when we reach back into the past, not to stay there, but to pull something forward, something worth keeping. The wind is cooler now, the garden is sleeping, and somewhere in the dark a seed stirs beneath the soil, just waiting for morning.